All right, let's get this thing started. Welcome, everyone. I am so incredibly thrilled that you're all here and grateful that you've all chosen to spend your time with us today. We should have about 70 people or so joining throughout the morning or afternoon or evening as the case may be. And it just is, I couldn't be happier thinking of all of these smart and dedicated people coming together from around the world to help our kids. So first of all, let me say that I have never done anything like this before. I've never organized a conference. I've never spoken to this many people, probably. So I'm a little nervous, but we do have some AV support. So I hope we won't have any technical issues and everything will go smoothly. I do want to remind everybody that if you would like to access the translation services, you can click on the link in the chat or scan that QR code if you want to use your phone for it. And that'll take you to the website that will provide that translation. Also, if you have any technical issues, just feel free to type a message in the chat and we will try to help you out with that. All right, so first of all, I would like to share a fundraising video that we created for Rare Disease Day last year that shares a bit of our family's story and how we got started on this path to create the foundation.
This is where we met Tristan for the first time.
Tristan was born November 26, 2019, the youngest of our 4 boys. From the minute I saw him, I thought something looked a little off about his eyes, but none of the doctors or nurses mentioned anything or seemed concerned, so I didn't think too much more of it. When he was about 4 months old, we started noticing that he wasn't reaching for things or bearing weight on his legs like his brothers had. So we got him into PT and OT and figured he would catch up, as many children do. He's not that far behind physically, so we were completely unprepared for the severity of the diagnosis. The one that hit me hardest was the fact that he would probably never speak. I don't know why, but in all of my wildest, worst case scenarios, it never even crossed my mind that my little boy wouldn't be able to talk to me. It took a long time for it to start to sink in. That first month, every single day, it was a fresh gut punch. I would wake up in the morning, fine for a second, and then suddenly it would all come rushing back in and it would literally take my breath away. And then, about a month after the diagnosis, he had his first seizure.
When I pulled up to the house, I actually heard the sirens coming down the street as I came in. I'll never forget when I walked into the house and saw Colt at the top of the stairs and the look on his face that just, Daddy, something's wrong with Tristy. I rushed up the stairs and of course fearing the worst and didn't know what I was going to find, and I come in, Michelle's over Tristan, he's on the ground, and she's trying to calm him down, stroking his head and singing to him, trying to get him to start breathing. And I mean, Michelle was a rock star that day. The paramedics and the firefighters, they followed me into the house afterwards and they got him on oxygen and put him in the ambulance and rushed him to the hospital with Michelle. It's just, that's when it all hit me. This is real. Tristan has this life-shattering disorder, and our family's lives will never be the same.
I've had to almost completely give up my private practice because of all the therapies and doctor appointments and exercises. He's in therapy 5 days a week, hours a day, but the progress is painfully slow. As he's gotten older, it's become more and more clear how impaired his little brain is. He works so hard to learn things, but even when something finally clicks, and he's been doing it consistently for weeks, it can suddenly vanish. And if you ask him to try to say or do something that he used to know, it totally breaks my heart. He's looking, his eyes are darting all over your face, his mouth is moving, he's breathing hard.
I mean, he's trying so hard, he just can't get his body to cooperate.
Tristan is the sweetest, most loving little person. He's always toddling over to lay his head in our laps or grab us as we're walking by. When he's alert and engaged, he's such a happy, affectionate little love bug. But a lot of the time, he's just off in his own world, kind of checked out, zoned out, like at Christmas. All the other kids were so excited and tearing into presents, and he's just sitting there, staring off into space. I just want so desperately for him to be able to participate in things with our family and enjoy things with the rest of us.
Thinking about the future is pretty overwhelming. I mean, these kids can't ever be left alone. They can't feed themselves. They can't ever even be potty trained.
And it just gets harder as they get older. I mean, just imagine having a Kevin-sized toddler for the rest of your life. It becomes very difficult to do anything as a family. We see with other families, they try to do something as simple as going to a game, and they end up spending the whole time trying to keep their full-grown kid from grabbing other people's food or climbing over the seats. It would be one thing if these kids were happy and healthy overall, but it doesn't seem like most of them are. Many will go months where they only sleep a few hours a night. Lots of the kids are on anxiety meds for agitation, and some will go through periods where they have hours-long crying spells every day. And of course, it can be impossible to figure out the problem because they can't tell you if they're in pain or what's going on. After spending every spare minute for almost a year researching KCNH1 and contacting scientists all over the world, we've learned that there's a clear path forward for KCNH1. It's a very good candidate for gene expression therapy. In other similar disorders that have been treated with this therapy, kids have gone from wheelchair-bound to walking, nonverbal to verbal, multiple seizures a day to seizure-free.
The technology exists, but the funding doesn't. As far as traditional drug development is concerned, KCNH1 is too rare to care. That's why it's up to us to make this happen. We need to raise $1 million to cure KCNH1.
All right, so that's where we were 1 year ago, a little less than a year ago, actually. We had just created the foundation and started to fundraise. And within about 6 or 9 months of that, our foundation had funded the design, manufacture, and screening of a batch of antisense oligonucleotides and identified a couple of hits. We had funded a repurposed drug screen that also has identified a couple of interesting hits. We have created some invaluable models like iPSC-induced pluripotent stem cell lines. that can be used to test these potential treatments. And maybe most importantly to an impatient parent, we were able to start our son Tristan on a repurposed drug. Dr. Perlstein has developed our roadmap, and he will be sharing that, but basically we have a 3-step approach that we're taking to identifying and developing treatments. And the first step is repurposed drugs, repurposed medications that could potentially be accessed fairly quickly. And step 2 will be the development of antisense oligonucleotides. And then long-term, our goal is base editing or gene editing that will actually correct that single incorrect nucleotide that causes our kids so many problems. So Dr. Perlstein will be sharing about our ASO project. So I'll focus on the repurposed drug screen. And first of all, because it happened, or we started on it first, Tristan's case or experience trying a repurposed drug. So thanks to all the basic research that many of you here had done, we were able to get Tristan access to a translational medicine fairly quickly, not quickly enough for an impatient parent, but fairly quickly. And so pretty soon after Tristan was diagnosed, I started, of course, staying up all night, reading all the KCNH1 articles I could find and contacting researchers. And within a few months, we had been told about a existing FDA-approved small molecule medication that is known to inhibit the channel encoded by KCNH1, KV10.1. And even though this medication is an old generic FDA-approved med that's actually on label for pediatric populations, it took us a full year of doing very thorough background before starting him on this investigational med. So we did lots of in vitro tests, lots of medical tests and consultations with lots of doctors. We did developmental testing to get a baseline. And then finally, this past summer, we were able to start him on the medication. And we went in with pretty guarded expectations, not necessarily expecting much. And within a couple of days, we seemed to be noticing that he was making better eye contact. And then within a couple more days, he started picking up new skills at a rate we had never, ever seen. This is a kid who has been rated in the less than 0.1 percentile cognitively and adaptively. So learning anything is very hard for him. His progress is extremely slow. And for a couple of weeks after he started the medication, he was learning new skills every single day. But then it was things like, nothing we would have necessarily thought of or looked for. It was things like figuring out how to open a door handle, which for a kid like him is a very complex motor task. He has to brace himself. He has to pull down with one hand, move his body out of the way and pull back toward himself. I was just shocked when he learned that after me showing it to him once. He learned many of these skills that he showed those first 2 weeks were things that we had been working on in therapies for weeks, months, or even years. He figured out, or finally it clicked, how to go down it, scooch himself to the edge and go down a slide by himself. Things like manipulating a spoon into his mouth finally clicked after a year of working on it. One thing that really surprised us was, we go through our day just narrating to him, and usually he seems to pay no attention. And my husband said, "Tristan, do you want to read a book?" And he looked around on the ground, saw a book, and went over and tried to pick it up. So it, again, obviously, we all know without a placebo-controlled trial, you can't assume anything, you can't know anything, but it seemed pretty promising at first, and then it stopped. And most of the skills that he had learned, he maintained, but it was the rate of skill acquisition that gradually tapered off and kind of returned back to his baseline, which is very, very slow. So we increased, again, after consulting everyone, we increased the dose and did not see the same thing. We did not see any further benefit. So that just goes to show how complex all of this is. The current status is we're going to be very gradually tapering him off, washing it out, and then reintroducing at the same lower dose, see if we get the same effect. But I wanted to share this case example with you for a couple of reasons. First of all, to all the families here, you know, to me, even though it's completely anecdotal, it gives me hope that these kinds of approaches and these kinds of treatments can help, they can work. But it's not going to be quick and easy. It's going to be complicated and maybe messy. You know, we might, when we get to treatments in the future, it might easily work for some kids and not for other kids, or have side effects that, you know, aren't worth it. For the researchers and doctors in the audience, I think it goes to show how hard it's going to be to identify meaningful endpoints. So, you know, something like opening a door handle or going down a slide, that it's huge for Tristan, but that's not going to show up on any Vineland or Bailey or standardized measure. So it's, you know, it's very meaningful for him, but it's going to be really challenging to find ways to measure outcomes. Okay, so moving on, Jeff, if you could share the rare base slide. Okay, so one of the main projects that we did this year was contracting with a biotech company their whole mission is to get treatments to rare disease patients as quickly as possible. And so their approach is to, well, they take patient-derived cell lines and start developing those into iPSCs. Meanwhile, they get the results from their function platform, which for that they used wild-type iPSCs neurons to screen, I believe, about 4,000 approved medications against 15,000 genes, with the goal of identifying compounds that either up or down regulate the gene. And so this process took several months, and we just got our results recently. And indeed, they did identify several compounds that modulate the gene, some that both up and down regulated. So the next step will be to validate those in patient-derived cell lines and see if those compounds can rescue the phenotype and correct the dysfunctions. So that's kind of an overview of what we've been focusing on with the foundation the past year. Finally, I would just like to really encourage the families today. It's going to be a lot of science. I know it's kind of science heavy. I would really encourage you to try to absorb it as much as you can. Follow up with questions if you have them. It's going to be really important as we move toward treatment for everyone to know their kid's mutation, because a lot of the treatments will depend on the particular function of your kid's mutation. And, you know, pitch in, get involved. All of this research is incredibly expensive, and it's going to take all of us as a team working together, whether that's, you know, hosting a bake sale or doing a Facebook birthday fundraiser, all the way up to, I hope, you know, to finally be put on some of our first big in-person fundraising events this year. But one of the biggest and most important ways that you all as families can contribute and advance the science is by sharing your patient data. It is just crucial to the long-term prospects of getting treatments to our kids. Our kids' disorder is ultra rare. There have been a few papers published on them, but there's so much that we don't know and that the medical community doesn't know. And the only way they can learn about it is for us to share it with them. So I would really encourage, and that's sharing things like everything from what symptoms your kids have, whether, do they have GI issues, heart issues, other things that go along with the main symptoms of KCNH1. Everything from symptoms to when they hit their milestones to what meds work and what meds don't. And as they age, what that looks like, because we don't have a lot of information about that. And so that will be one of the biggest ways that you can help support the research, is taking the time to, one of my biggest goals for the foundation for the coming year is to launch a registry or natural history study. And then I'll need every one of you families to take the time to, set up a profile that can link your kids' medical records, or maybe fill out an occasional survey about their status or their symptoms or their seizures or whatever the case may be. So I just want to thank you all again so much for coming today, and we will move on now to some of our fantastic presenters. And first up on the list is Dr. Wendy Chung, and she unfortunately could not make it, but very graciously recorded a video just for the KCNH1 community. And since she's not here, I can hype her up a little bit. She's kind of a celebrity in the rare disease world. I think she's one of the few people in this space that I actually had heard of before Tristan was born, because of her involvement with a famous Supreme Court case. And she is one of the handful of doctors in the world who has a KCNH1 patient. And it was thanks to her and Noreen gathering a bunch of info from a bunch of the families that got Dr. George on board and led to some really important research. So I'm very pleased to share her message to us all.
Hi, my name's Wendy Chung. I'm a medical geneticist and physician scientist at Columbia University. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the things I've learned about rare genetic conditions and how family groups have worked together with scientists and doctors to be able to move forward towards treatment. I have called this treatment, and this is an acronym for thinking about targeted research and exploration to advance clinical models, editing, and next generation therapies. So trying to think about a roadmap of what you all can do together to advance the field and advance the cause for your children and your family members. The first that you have already done is gotten a diagnosis, and that's the most important first step, is to understand the club you're a part of, KCNH1. In a good way, from my point of view, this is an area of medicine that's relatively understood, that is a channel. And you're going to hear from researchers today who are world-class experts in studying channels. And from my perspective, there's a deep expertise and knowledge in knowing how to be able to modify the function of channels using medications in particular. So it just so happens, although you didn't do it by choice, that you ended up in a club that I think is a good club to be part of. So that's the first thing that you've done. The next thing is to find others who are like you, who are members of the same club, and stick together. You really need, the numbers are small because it's a rare condition and these are early days. There are many more of you out there than you realize, so do stick together and aggregate. Try not to splinter. As you're doing it, it becomes really important, I think, about a model of what I call the care until the cure. And thinking about the care, we need to learn from each other. We need to learn from just the things that we've tried by trial and error and figure out what things worked and what things didn't, and be able to disseminate that to other families, to other doctors, so that we can do a little bit less of the trial and error and get to hopefully some evidence that can guide what might be best practices in terms of thinking about this for the future. As you're thinking about moving toward the day when there would be clinical trials of treatments, it's important, and just trust me on this, to be able to have baseline data so that to know what things are like now, to be able to compare to when we try something new, a treatment in the future, a new experimental treatment, a clinical trial. to be able to minimize the number of people who have to be randomized to placebo or not do anything, and to allow for really robust data gathering. We want to have each person be their own control and know what they're like now so that we can see what happens if they start a new treatment, if things get better, if things get worse, but we need that comparison. Within this, we need to be able to understand what it is that we might see change. We need to look at those outcomes, whether the change is something that we see by looking at EEGs or electrical activity in the brain, whether there are other standardized outcome measures in particular that folks like the FDA would approve a medication for. We need to really do the practice part of things now, that exploration and being able to see that. Within this, there are going to be many researchers who will not necessarily be working on your channel on KCNH1, but you want to be able to de-risk it, to make it as easy as possible for researchers who might have good ideas about new treatments, new therapies, new ways to understand channel function, to be able to invite them and make it easy for them to do research and essentially work for you. What I'd say is to do that, you may want to develop as a group resources that help them do their work. This includes cells or cell lines from some of your individuals in the community, maybe mouse models, maybe what we call organoids or mini brains for them to study, but things to make it as easy as possible. As they're doing that, and again, you're going to hear from some of the best experts in the field today, there are data now to understand how the channel is functioning, and that's critical to be able to think about how to correct problems with the way it's functioning. So this is already work in progress, and trust me, you've got some of the best experts working on this already. In thinking about what that mechanism is for how the channels are not doing their job properly will help inform then what the best therapeutic strategies are, whether or not there are going to be certain classes of small molecules that'll be useful, whether there'll be other methods of genetic manipulation, what I call molecular methods, really critical to understand the mechanism and potentially reversibility. That is, whether or not this can be, the problems can be reversed or made better, or whether we just stay status quo and stable and prevent things from getting worse. But that's part of what we do in the preclinical era. So especially if they're animal models, mouse models are what we often do first to try some of these treatments and to know whether or not it makes things better. And then ultimately, the last stage is the clinical trials. It's doing it in people. It's doing it in a safe way, making sure that as much as we can, we do know that whatever might be tried is safe. That sometimes is based on looking at safety data for a medication used for other purposes. It might be based on the molecular or genetic therapies used for another condition, using, for instance, a vector or a delivery system. All sorts of places where we get information about safety, but to understand whether or not the treatment actually works in people, we're really going to need to try that in people who have this condition. I will say the volunteers that consent to do this, that is the study participants, you owe a debt of gratitude, whether it might be your family member or someone else in the community. They're brave pioneers. We do this all with the hope that these treatments will work, but as we go into it, we don't know. And so these are really individuals who are dedicated not only for understanding something for themselves, but understand for the rest of the community. So it's important to recognize and appreciate those individuals who make that leap. As we do this, to realize that this takes time and to be patient. These are tough experiments. They don't happen overnight. Many of these can be done simultaneously. They don't have to be done in the stepwise series that I've said here, but many things can go on simultaneously to move the field faster. And as you're doing it, there are a lot of people who care a lot about you and your condition, but it's helping to make, like I said, it's hard. Things these days are hard for everyone, to try and make it as easy for people to do what they do well, but to work with you as a partner as you do it. As you're thinking about things, always important to respect individuals' privacy in the community. People are willing to share a lot of information, but to respect information that they might want to keep private, but to be able to aggregate that information and to share it in a de-identified way as widely as possible. Being able to leverage the investment that you're making so that you might contribute information once, but it might be helpful to potentially dozens of investigators around the world is what you want to be able to finally achieve. And as you're doing this, to realize that everyone really needs to stand up and be counted. That is, that the genetic variants in the KCNH1 gene are oftentimes unique to the individual. And if you don't do your part, no one can represent that particular variant but you. And so it really takes the whole community banding together, working together to make sure that you can help each other in moving this forward. So look forward to doing anything I can personally in terms of advancing this. We've got a great group assembled here today, and I know this is the beginning of something exciting.
All right, I'd like to open it up to some questions because that was geared toward the families, but anybody is welcome to ask any questions. I know, again, some of this stuff may be a little new, a little unfamiliar, a little over your head, so please, anyone, feel free to type in a question. And feel free to type in a question at any point, but if we don't have any right now, we'll move right on to Stephanie Teleska's presentation. And I met Stephanie, or we connected, I think, about a year ago after her daughter was diagnosed with another potassium channelopathy in the KCNH1 gene. And she and I quickly became very close friends because we're dealing with this crazy thing of trying to raise severely disabled kids while also starting a foundation and raising money and trying to develop treatments. So she's been a wonderful support to me, but the reason she's here today is because she actually was a part of this rare disease world long before her daughter was born in a professional capacity. She is a genetic counselor, so I thought she would be the perfect person to explain the basics of the genetics of KCNH1 to all of us non-scientists on the meeting today.
Thank you, Michelle, for the introduction and for inviting me to speak today. It is a great pleasure to be here to speak to all the families and help give you the tools to understand a little bit more about your child's diagnosis and how to navigate this new world, and also giving you the tools to help understand the path forward with the treatment options. So I'm just going to pull up my presentation. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. However, if you want to wait until the end, that is also appropriate. As I mentioned, this is really just for you guys to learn the basics. So we will be talking about, just genetics 101. This is, our overview will start very broad. We'll talk in general about DNA, genes, chromosomes, talking about different inheritance patterns, what variants mean and what the classifications mean. And then we'll talk a little bit more specifically about ion channels and how the variants can impact the ion channel and how that will influence our approach to treatment. So just a little bit about me. I graduated from Sarah Lawrence College Human Genetics program in 2013 with a Master's of Science, and soon after that became an American board certified genetic counselor. I've been working in the field of medical genetics since then and currently hold a role in prenatal genetics at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto, Canada. But I met Michelle, as she said, about a year ago after my daughter, Eliana, was diagnosed with a KCNH1 gene variant, so a different potassium channel, but very similar in terms of the outcomes. I've also established a foundation for my daughter's condition to help raise money and awareness to accelerate the path to a cure. All right, so if we take a step back and think about high school biology, you may all recall that our bodies are made out of billions and billions of cells. Inside each of our cells, we have over 20,000 genes or instructions that tell our body how to grow and how to develop. All of these genes are packaged into structures that we call chromosomes. And if you were to take one chromosome and unwind it, you'll see that it's made from a very long strand of DNA. Segments or pieces of our DNA, we call them genes, And genes have their own alphabet of A, T, G, and C. So these different combination of these 4 letters create different words that our body can read through, and then it creates proteins. And proteins are what are doing work in our body. When we think about genetic conditions can happen at the level of a chromosome. It can happen at the level of the DNA strand. But today we're going to focus on genetic conditions, or one genetic condition that happens when there is a typo inside of the gene. So having a spelling mistake inside that gene. Before we talk about those typos, I'm just going to focus on where KCNH1 gene is and show you that when we take all the chromosomes from one cell and create a picture, we have something called a karyotype. And we all typically have 46 chromosomes that form 23 pairs. The first 22 pairs of chromosomes are the same in both males and females, and it's the 23rd pair that differ. Females have 2 X's and males have 1 X and 1 Y, which I don't have an image of. But the KCNH1 gene is located on chromosome 1 in this little area here at 32.2. We have 2 copies of the KCNH1 gene, and typically they are both working just fine. So just, and this is just important to remember when we talk about the inheritance patterns. So a lot of people who have a child with KCNH1 may not have a family history of this. And this is because this condition can happen by chance, or what we call de novo. And this is something that happens at the time of conception. There are genetic conditions that can be inherited from an affected parent. And then not related to KCNH1, but there are conditions that you may hear of that happen because the parents are carriers for the recessive condition. So that means that both the copy from mom and the copy from dad, are not working properly. But in KCNH1, it's just one of the 2 copies of that gene that are non-functional that cause the disorder. So in these cases, when it's not inherited from an affected parent, we call this a de novo dominant. So both mom and dad are unaffected. And when they have a child, they see that one of the kids may have the spontaneous mutation or variant that causes the diagnosis. So I'm just going to, okay, sorry, I was looking at the chat. You may also have heard of some dominant conditions that are inherited from an affected parent. So we call this autosomal dominant because it does not matter if it's from the mom or the dad, and they can pass on the condition equally to a son or a daughter. So in this condition, the affected parent will either pass on the genetic condition that they have 50% of the time, or the normal working copy of that gene 50% of the time, and have an unaffected child. And then rarely, there can be a case of what we call mosaicism. So mosaicism happens after conception, when there's a genetic change that happens in one cell of the embryo. And as that one cell divides and grows into the baby or adult, parts of the individual will be affected by the genetic change or the genetic condition, and the other parts are not. So this individual would be called mosaic. So they don't have 100% of their cells that are affected by the genetic condition. And when someone who is mosaic goes to have a child of their own, they may have up to a 50% chance of passing that on. It really depends on where that, what cells in their body have the genetic change. And if it's in their gonads, so the eggs or the sperm, then they will have a 50% chance of passing that on. And their child would be 100% affected. So sometimes this can happen where a child is diagnosed with a genetic condition. It could be KCNH1. And then when the parents have follow-up testing, they find out that they actually have the genetic condition as well. And they may not have the same type of severity of symptoms as their child because not 100% of their cells in their body are affected. And this is just to show with recessive or autosomal recessive conditions, when both mom and dad are a carrier for a recessive condition, they have a 25% chance of having a child with the genetic condition and a 75% chance to have an unaffected child. Again, we don't see this with KCNH1 families, but I just wanted to bring this to your attention as you may hear about this when you're doing research and looking into different types of treatment modalities. So what are variants? And when people talk about variants or mutations, what is this referring to? So variants are, normal to have. We all have them. They make us who we are. So we all share almost like over 99% of the same DNA, but it's these small changes that make us unique, make us who we are. Variants can be classified as benign, unknown, or pathogenic. And the guidelines on how to determine what a variant is or what category it is classified into is based on a guideline from the American College of Medical Genetics. It incorporates published reports, computer programs or in silico predictions, empiric data, and functional studies, and sometimes even segregation studies. So how is this variant being inherited in a family, and who has it and who doesn't? Benign variants are also thought of as normal variants. So this is when they have information that says the variant is not responsible for causing disease. And then you may also hear of likely benign, and that means that there's a greater than 90% chance that the variant is not responsible for causing the disease. And an example that I like to use with the benign variant is the word color, where if you are American and you spell color, you spell it C-O-L-O-R. And if you are Canadian or British, you spell color with a U, so C-O-L-O-U-R. When you read them, it is a different spelling of the word, but it means the same thing, and it is not considered a spelling mistake. Variants of uncertain significance are just variants that are found that have insufficient data about that variant in order to know if it's responsible for the diagnosis or the disease or not. We all, these variants that we have in our genes, we don't always understand how it's impacting our body. And that is because no one is like a native DNA speaker. We don't have a reference to go to say, is this a normal variant? So a U or not a U in the word color, or is it a full typo, meaning that it's really not the way to spell that word? With more research and data that is collected over time, variants of uncertain significance are typically reclassified. And then pathogenic, which is what I think a lot of families here would find on their child's genetic test report. A pathogenic variant means that that variant is responsible for causing the disease. And then you may also see likely pathogenic. And again, that's a greater than 90% chance that the variant is responsible for causing the disease. And an example of this is if you were to remove the letter L from the word color, it does not mean the same thing anymore. And you would look at that and say, well, I'm not really sure what they're trying to say. So it would be a complete spelling error. Okay, so now we're going to jump into ion channels, and this is just an image of a human cell. We're not really going to focus on all of that. We're just really going to look at the plasma membrane, and that's where we're going to find these ion channels that we're going to talk about. So an ion channel is found, as I mentioned, in the plasma membrane, and this is, it allows ions or charged molecules to either enter the cell when it's open, or they can exit the cell membrane. And this is one way that cells communicate with one another. We know that with the cell membranes, they all have like a neutral charge. So if we think about like electrical activity, and this is how we can think about sometimes the ions moving is causing the cells to become positive or negative, or more positive or more negative. But they all sort of start at this like neutral charge, and the flow of the ions into and out of the cell will change that. And that is one type of communication that we see. And this type of communication is represented by what is called an action potential. I'm not going to go into all the details about this, but essentially when the cell receives a signal, it will depolarize and you'll have an influx of ions, and then it will then repolarize where there will be a flow of ions out, and then it comes back to its neutral or its resting state so that it can begin the communication all over again. Okay, sorry, I missed Lynn's question. So the risk of having another affected child, we can get, it really depends on if the condition was inherited or not. So Lynn, I'll respond to you separately. And if other people have questions, I can maybe go into a little bit more detail about that at the end. Sorry. So when we are thinking of KCNH1, it is considered a voltage-gated potassium ion channel. And this allows potassium to flow out of the cell when it opens. And what it's really doing is it's bringing back the cell to its neutral state or resting state. And this allows, as I mentioned, for the continued flow of information. And this is just an image of a neuron. So KCNH1, it codes, or the instructions of that gene create the potassium voltage gated channel KV10.1. So a lot of people may refer to it as KV10.1 rather than KCNH1, or you might hear both of them together when referring to the disorder. This channel is found in the brain, the heart, and it's also identified in a lot of different cancers or tumors. Disease-causing or pathogenic variants in this gene are associated, with different human diseases, and specifically the syndromes that are associated with are the Temple-Barretzer syndrome or Zimmerman-Leban syndrome type 1. They're considered neurodevelopmental disorders and developmental and epileptic encephalopathies. So this is just sort of like the umbrella condition it falls under. When the ion channel or KV10.1 does not work properly, and this is because of the type of variants that are in the gene, and the variants will cause the gene to do different things. So you may hear of loss of function, and this can sometimes cause a reduction in the number of channels that are present, or cause the channel to open too slowly or close too fast. So then you don't have enough potassium leaving the cell membrane or the cell, and the cell cannot continue communicating at the right speed to the next cell. I think a lot of individuals with KCNH1 related disorders will have a gain of function, and this causes the channel to open too quickly and it does not close fast enough. And so you can think of this as being like a loose channel. So too much potassium is leaving the cell. And again, this does not allow the cell to continue communicating at the right speed. So in summary, the electrical activity of the brain cell is disturbed when the ion channel is not working properly, and that can lead to an increased risk of seizures or like abnormal electrical activity. The disruption of the proper brain cell function also impairs normal function and therefore normal or typical development. So this is all important to know because our approach to treatment, although the goal is going to be the same, which is to normalize the flow of ions into and out of the cell, knowing how the variant is impacting KV10.1 will allow us to approach it appropriately. So when we are talking about a medication, we want to know, do we need to close the channel faster, or do we need to leave it open longer? So that would depend on whether or not it's a gain or loss of function. There's also protein regulation, and this is when we try to reduce the abnormal KCNH1 protein from being made. So then you're either going to need to upregulate the normal copy, or not. And so this can improve the way that the KV10.1 channel is working, because if you have less abnormal copy, then you're going to have the channel that's made properly. And then in terms of gene editing, this would be targeting this specific typo in the gene and going in and fixing it. And I think this is something that we all aim towards, but right now it's not something that I think is necessarily in the works. So to summarize all the information, KCNH1 is an autosomal dominant neurodevelopmental and epileptic encephalopathy disorder. A majority of the cases are de novo. However, there are some individuals that have an affected parent. KV10.1 is the voltage gated potassium channel that is coded by KCNH1 gene. Pathogenic and likely pathogenic variants impact how the flow of potassium leaves the cell membrane. And treatment modalities are dependent on how the flow of potassium is impacted. And so questions, I think. Okay.
I think we're running a little bit long, but of course, if anybody wants to type in a question, Stephanie, into the chat, then Stephanie can answer it there. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Tracy Gertler. I connected with Dr. Gertler through yet another different potassium channelopathy mom who referred me to her because she has great expertise in these channelopathies and is also just a wonderful and kind human and doctor. And Dr. Gertler is going to be presenting, Tristan, she sees Tristan via telehealth, and she'll be presenting on the clinical presentation of KCNH1 related disorders.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm going to breeze through this a little bit and try to hit the highlights, but I'm happy to answer questions later. Michelle asked me to talk.
Dr. Gertler, I'm sorry to interrupt. We were seeing your presentation, but then you moved it over. I'm not sure if you could move it back. That would be great. Thank you.
How's that?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for interrupting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the clinical presentation of some of the KCNH1 associated conditions. I know we've already spoken about Temple-Barretzer syndrome and Zimmerman-Leban syndrome and how we've known it by different eponyms, but now that we understand the gene, I think it's most helpful to keep using the gene name, and then we can talk about variability in the phenotype. In several of the early papers that have come out, they have included images of characteristic facial features of these children. So we see elongated faces, and what you'll notice is that there seems to be some weakness or decreased activation of the facial muscles. For the clinicians, that's what we call myopathic face. And that can be helpful as a signal to consider some of the potassium channelopathies like KCNH1. We also see in multiple papers pictures of the hands and feet, and you'll notice shortened digits that are a little bit farther away. So the thumb that is a little bit farther from the other fingers, and then either absent or smaller nails. And these first descriptions were really made when a clinical diagnosis based on facial features, developmental delay, seizures were put together and said, okay, we don't have an answer for why these children have these challenges. What is the gene that we can identify? So this first paper in 2015 noted that 5 kids with Temple-Barretzer syndrome all had variants in the KCNH1 gene that encodes a potassium channel, as you just heard. Subsequent papers looked at kids who didn't have other genes that were known to cause similar features and be associated with Zimmerman-Leban and Temple-Barretzer, but also noted primarily de novo variants that were in the channel. There is some talk about whether these variants cluster in certain parts of the channel. We often see an increased risk of having a genetic syndrome when the most important parts of a channel, like the part where the potassium ions themselves flow through, or the part of the channel that detects a change in voltage is affected. And I think the jury's still out for KCNH1. So really having more knowledge of more cases as a greater number of families sign on and agree to provide their genetic information and correlate that to what they see in their children is really helpful. And this is the third paper that we have that really looks at these children. And I just wanted to pull up this table to point out some of the common features, because although it is a small population, we're starting to learn more. So as we mentioned, most of the cases are de novo, meaning new in the child, not found in the parents, although now there are several reports where parents have what we call low-level mosaicism, meaning only a very small percentage of their cells have that variant, and they are able to pass it on. It doesn't seem that there's a male or female sex predominance. Most kids do have intellectual disability and seizures, although the severity of the intellectual disability and seizures are variable. We see the coarse facial features, the enlarged gums that we mentioned, and the changes in fingers and nails, and then scoliosis or curvature of the spine is another common feature. This is, as I mentioned before, we're really curious to know, do these variants seem to sit in the same place in the gene or in the protein that's encoded? And this is important because when we think about medications, many medications are targeted towards a specific part of a protein. And when we want to know which one is most effective, we want to know which one is going to change how that protein works in a way that would help most children too. So this is the paper that suggests that many kids with epilepsy have these changes in the gene or the protein in the parts of the protein that bring together the different passes through the membrane. The big point of this slide is that having more variants and seeing where the common variants fall is critical. We know a little bit more about epilepsy in these children as well. So we see generalized, meaning seizures that come from all over the brain, and focal seizures that come from one very small part. And in a large number of kids, we see that the background EEG, or the recording, even when they're not having seizures, is different than what we would expect of other children this age. And so this may be a very helpful biomarker going forward when we're trying to assess, is a medication working? Is a gene therapy working? It doesn't necessarily have to be only a change in seizure number. Sometimes the improvement in those background brain rhythms can be an indication of whether a drug is helpful. And a latest report also points out that some children with KCNH1 variants actually don't have the soft tissue findings or the skeletal findings, meaning the same facial features or the changes in their nails and finger length. And that's important because as we start to test more and more for kids with KCNH1 variants, or more broadly, we're going to find more children and the phenotype is going to broaden, meaning not everybody is going to have a textbook case. But still having these families participate in the natural history study is critical because we want to know the full spectrum of what's associated with the gene and why some kids are more or less affected. This is an image that I stole from a different disease foundation talking about mitochondrial variants, but I think it's helpful in that it illustrates we can characterize a syndrome by a phenotype, meaning how children appear, how we diagnose them clinically, and by a genotype. And sometimes those two things happen independently, but then when they come together, that's when we really start to learn what is the disease, what is the disease mechanism, and how can we improve upon it. And I mostly wanted to echo what Dr. Chung said about the importance of a natural history study. So once we get data about as many children as possible, we can better understand what does the disease look like over time? How does it change as children get older? What are the biomarkers that we can use to follow disease progression? And if you look on the bottom graph, clinical trials have traditionally included a placebo group, which means children who are not being actively treated. But if we're able to assemble a robust natural history study where we understand the progression of the disease for most children, then that decreases the need for a placebo, meaning that we can treat more children off the bat. So I'm going to end there, and I'm happy to pass it back to Michelle or take questions.
Tracy, just really quickly, we did have one question about the risk of passing an asymptomatic mosaic parent passing on the gene, the dysfunctional gene.
Yeah, so it's a challenging question because we have limited ways of testing for mosaicism right now. And really, we want to test for mosaicism in eggs or sperm because that would be what's most relevant to the next generation. So there are companies working on that, but it's not something clinically available. The best we can do is test parents and see if they have the gene to the limits of what we can detect, and counsel that most likely they will not have another child, but there is a possibility that that variant is present in eggs or sperm and we just can't detect it right now from blood. So if that is a question that is really important, it's also worth talking to a prenatal genetic counselor and finding out about early testing of a fetus, either through CVS or amniocentesis, to see, does the fetus have that variant, or there are some other technologies that can be used in combination with in vitro fertilization as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I think if everyone's okay with it, we're gonna skip the break. We will have a break after this coming session, but I would like to go ahead and introduce you to Dr. Ethan Perlstein. Dr. Perlstein is, I would say, one of the most knowledgeable and well-connected people in the rare disease world. And he really gets the parents' sense of urgency, and I really appreciate his support of the community. He also hosts a fantastic meetup every week of a lot of us parents and foundations trying to do this. That is an invaluable source of information. So I will pass it off to Ethan to introduce our KCNH1 roadmap.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see everybody on a weekend. I might have an intruder come in, my 3-year-old, so hopefully we can roll with that. But thanks, Michelle, for allowing me to share with everybody here the cure map or cure roadmap that we put together about a year ago. So it could use some refreshing, but I think the core principles are valid. Should I pull up the screen share on my end, or will that be done by you, Jeff?
Yeah, if you could share your screen and control your own slides, that'd be great. If you would like me to do it, I could.
No problem at all. Let me just get them open here. Okay, one sec. Here we go. All right, does everybody see the slides okay?
Yep.
Yeah, just put it in slideshow mode. We should be good to go. Thank you.
Okay.
Looks great.
So if anyone wants to dig in deeper on this, you can check out our Substack, perlara.substack.com. Again, this was a document that was put together by Dr. Tracy Gertler, who was just speaking, Dr. Whitley Nolan, who I think Dolan was in the audience, and myself. This was prepared on behalf of the Cure KCNH1 Foundation. I'm just going to cover the highlights here in the interest of time, and also because you could explore the document on your own. And also, as I said, some of the aspects need some refreshing, but the core principles and recommendations, I think, stand. So I want to just acknowledge, we've heard that word pioneer earlier today from Dr. Chung. I want to echo that and just recognize Michelle and her family as being pioneers and community builders in the KCNH1 community. And so thanks again for organizing this event and all the other work you've been doing to galvanize this community. So I am not a KCNH1 or electrophysiology or potassium channelopathy expert. But I've heard now KV 10.1 a fair number of times today. You probably have too. If that's sort of sailing over your head, I think we'll have some of the world's experts on this channel engage with us later, and hopefully do so in a way where the real complexity, but also beauty of this beautiful electrical machine can be kind of explored more deeply. Again, I just want to show off these pretty images for the time being, since we'll go into more detail in the later sessions. And we organized this cure map around Tristan and his de novo never before reported gain of function variant. And that sort of profile of de novo heterozygous gain of function is a common theme in KCNH1, as I think we've learned. Of course, the principles we've applied to this variant can be extended to other variants, but this was sort of a test case. And I'm just, again, showing you here this structure mostly to highlight the location of this one amino acid change, this proline 560S serine, which is responsible for all the problems here. So we tried to organize this document around tracks, research tracks, and we are not shy about embracing the word cure. Obviously, the foundation does as well, but we know that you get there through a journey and a series of progressions and stages. So we like to organize a thought around sort of short, medium, and long-term tracks. And we already sort of got a taste of what the drug repurposing track looks like and how that's a very short-term track, because that's something that can be done in a so-called hypothesis-driven way or in a data-driven way, where you can make an informed decision based on data or published accounts that might suggest a particular drug like imipramine is a good idea to test. And so we can expand on that point in a second. Then in parallel, obviously, there's a medium-term track, and that would be development of a so-called allele-specific antisense oligonucleotide, ASO. Don't have to get into the details of what that is now, but it's a type of targeted genetic medicine. And when we wrote the roadmap, we did not know yet whether KCNH1, whether Tristan's case would be taken up by NLRM Foundation. We have subsequently found that it has, but we also outlined in the cure map a strategy for what's called an allele agnostic ASO, or an ASO that would work across the board for KCNH1 potentially. There is some scientific risk to figure out, but I'll share one example of how last year we were able to very quickly mobilize a research team to act on this allele agnostic track and generate some early data, which hopefully Drs. Pardo and George might be able to expand upon. And then longer term, the vision is toward something more curative. As I said, we get there kind of in stages. And so there's a technology out there called base editing, which is a flavor of CRISPR that has the great promise of being able to go in and change that one single letter mistake that is responsible for many of these KCNH1 channelopathies. This base editing technology is the frontier of medicine. It's the frontier when being applied to tissues like blood, which are something you can manipulate outside the body. So a tissue like the brain is a frontier even still, but it's something to keep as, I think, your North Star, because at the end of the day, the goal is to have a curative treatment that goes to the root cause of the disease. So drug repurposing, I often now refer to it as drug multi-purposing, because I think we're going to be surprised how often old drugs will sort of get a rebirth and a reappearance in a new disease indication. I like to emphasize also 1 to N as opposed to N of 1. I think 1 to N sort of is more accurate in that if an investigational treatment or whatever intervention is explored on one patient, if it works, the goal is to extend it to others and not just keep it to one. And I think N of 1 should be reserved really for these edge cases where there really aren't any other patients out there and you're really a tribe of one. But for most, you're not really a tribe of one for long, especially if you are taking a global perspective. So Michelle already talked about her kind of case study here with imipramine, and hopefully we can return to this in the discussion section. We can also go about doing repurposing in a more unbiased way where we can take advantage of cell lines and examine specific variants and do what's called electrophysiological assays and try to restore the functional defect. We can do some clever things like screen against effects on the heart, because there's reasons why we want to avoid that, given that the KAV10.1 channel, KV10.1 channel is similar to a channel in the heart. And so that's something to be aware of. And then if necessary, although we don't think it's necessary, you could pursue even a mouse model to gain more confidence, but it's not necessarily required. Then there's the antisense oligonucleotide track I kind of mentioned here. This is just a schematic of how that would work. If in the allele agnostic context, where you could apply an ASO to knock down KCNH1 expression across the board, we actually did some experiments last year with a group called IXLs, and that's based in San Diego. It's local to Michelle, and we were able to actually very quickly design a relatively modest number, a few dozen sequences, have them screened, and identify here these green circles, 2 ASOs, 2 compounds that can reduce the expression of KCNH1 by 50%. So we already showed by this proof of concept that it's possible to develop a plan and execute on that plan very swiftly and start to generate some preliminary data and get some excitement going. And doing this obviously in parallel with these other activities, because you can't put all of your eggs necessarily in one basket. And just a teaser here at the end, base editing really has this promise to go and address the root cause of the disease. So when you've got that dreadful, variant, pathogenic variant report or variant of unknown significance, but it was really just that one letter that seemingly was at the root of all of this. Well, this is a technology that promises to make that, change that typo in the DNA very, very precisely. Although again, that is a nascent technology. It is just being developed for application on blood and tissues that are very easy or easier to manipulate. And so the brain is definitely a frontier, but I think this is something that, again, warrants potentially some early foundational investments and explorations, because longer term, I think this gene editing strategy is going to be one option to really do something curative. So I'll be respectful that we're over time here, and I will therefore stop here, and hopefully we can return to some of these topics in the open Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Ethan, for speeding through that and helping us hopefully get a little bit more back on track. Okay, I would like to go ahead and share, we may run out of time for both of the videos, but I would like to go ahead and share one of the patient videos. Jeff, can you roll the first one?
Hi, I'm Noreen. I live in New York City with my husband Ed and my 2 sons, Rafi and Remy. When we first received Rafi's diagnosis, it was extremely scary. There was little to no information online about temple Barrettser. There was a few articles that had been written, but most of the doctors we had seen had never heard of the disorder because it was extremely rare. I think there was maybe 15 kids with the diagnosis at this time. Thankfully, we came across the Facebook community, and they've been a really wonderful support system. All the families around the world, especially the moms and the dads with the older children. It's been really wonderful and great to get to know them and learn more about what's in store for Rafi. I think the group is probably up to about 40 to 50 kids now. It's been growing really fast. So in New York City, we're lucky to have access to a lot of the most wonderful doctors. We love our neurologist, Dr. Naja. She helps us deal with the hardest part, which is Rafi's seizures. They're extremely scary. My husband and I feel often very helpless because there are no triggers, many times no warning signs, and even at 8 years old, they're really uncontrolled. He started to have them when he was about 6 weeks old. We've tried a number of different medications and we can't quite figure out what's the right one. So I think we'll be dealing with this for a long time. I'm hoping with a lot of the research that we're starting to do now, that can improve over the years. My father was a cardiologist and he always talked about the importance of research. So I'm hoping what we're kicking off here with the help of Michelle and of course Wendy Chung, a wonderful geneticist who helped us start to gather initial information, we are able to really learn more and help children our own and any new children with the diagnosis in the future. Rafi just turned 8, he's right here, Rafi. And he's a really happy kid. He loves music, he loves books, he loves puzzles. He and his younger brother love playing together. They have a really special bond. Rafi has also a really special bond with his dad. We call him Daddy's Tail because he follows him around everywhere. and we hope to meet everybody in person one day. This is Rafi. Hi, say hi. You say hi? Say hello. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Hi. Thanks, guys. Hi, Rafi. What are you doing? You're 8? Yeah, Rafi, what are you playing with? The train tracks?
Bonjour, je me présente Chantal, maman de ma belle Katia. Katia qui a 16 ans, bientôt 17 ans, dans à peu près 2 semaines. On habite au Canada, dans la province de Québec. Katia est atteinte du syndrome Temple-Barrett-Starr qu'on a découvert à ses 14 ans. Fait qu'on a su à ses 14 ans, elle a eu des symptômes suite à la naissance. Mais c'est ça, malgré son âge de 16 ans, c'est que elle a quand même elle a un âge mental de 8-10 mois, ce qui est très difficile. Elle fait rien toute seule, elle dépend de nous dans toutes les sphères de sa vie. On l'appelle notre bébé géant d'amour. Fait que c'est ça, s'il y avait un médicament qui pourrait alléger, faciliter plus son quotidien, puis notre quotidien. Ben c'est ça, ça serait. J'aimerais vraiment qu'elle ait plus conscience de ce qui l'entoure. Oh, petite chouette. Je t'aime, mon bébé. Qu'elle puisse nous dire je t'aime. Que j'ai l'impression qu'elle me reconnaît, nous reconnaît sa famille. J'ai pas l'impression qu'elle nous reconnaît. Ça, ça me fait de la peine des fois. Tu sais, mettons qu'on va la chercher à l'école, on arrive à l'école, comme ça on est des purs étrangers, là. Elle semble même pas nous reconnaître. Ça, je trouve ça difficile. Je trouve ça vraiment difficile. Les crises d'épilepsie, qu'on a de la misère aussi, l'avoir tombé et partir par une crise généralisée, c'est vraiment difficile pour notre cœur, hein, Kato? Mon beau petit bébé d'amour. Oui. Mon beau petit bébé d'amour. C'est tout toi. Dans le quotidien, ce que ça implique, c'est que elle dort pas, trop de sommeil, trop d'alimentation. Ah, ma belle fille. Ouais. Puis qu'est-ce qu'on trouve de mignon des cadeaux? C'est comme une quête rose quand elle danse. Qu'est-ce qu'elle fait quand elle danse? La manière qu'elle danse, qu'elle montre qu'elle est contente. Là. Je trouve ça vraiment mignon. Ou quand elle embarque dans le bain tout habillée parce qu'elle aime l'eau, elle aime prendre son bain. Fait qu'elle dans le bain tout habillée, nous faire comprendre qu'elle veut prendre son bain. Fait que c'est ça. Elle est un amour, hein. On l'aime profondément. Ah, ma belle! Katou! Katou! Katou! Un de mes grands souhaits, ça serait de voir Katia manger normalement, comme tout le monde. Comme une grande fille, manger le même avec les ustensiles, puis que ça soit pas compliqué, puis qu'elle aime, elle mange varié comme nous, puis parce que j'aimerais tellement ça.
Merhaba, Melih 14 yaşında, 5 yaşındayken Temple-Barrett-Starr sendromu teşhisi aldı. Bu sendrom ağır engellilik getiren bir sendrom. Hala yürüyemiyor, konuşamıyor, iletişim yok denecek kadar az. Biz onun gelişim basamaklarını tamamlayamadığından itibaren hem özel eğitim hem fizyoterapi aldırdık ancak ilerlediğimiz yol çok uzun bir yol olmadı. Bu yüzden de dünyada yapılan bilimsel çalışmalardan da umudumuz yüksek. Belki geliştirilecek bir ilaç ya da genetik bir tedavi Melih'in yürümesini, konuşmasını ya da farklı bir şekilde iletişim kurmasını hem onun hayatının hem de bizim hayatımızı kolaylaştıracağına inanıyoruz.
Ne? İstiyor musun? Evet. Evet mi? Söyle ver. Ver. Verdim. Ah. Tamam, alabilirsin ha? Aa, çok güzel. Evet, bayıldık armuta ya. Evet. Evet.
Ayaklarını çalıştır. Hadi oğlum. Ayaklar, ayaklar, ayaklar. Aferin. Yukarıya bak, yukarıya bak. Bravo. Aferin. Yukarı, yukarı. Hayır, dönme, dönme, dönme, dönme bu tarafa. Aferin. Başını kaldırma. Bravo, bravo. Bravo.
I just want to thank the families who submitted those videos so much. And I've been told that I can't cut the second family video. Everybody worked too hard on it. So I'm just going to ask all of us to hang tight and the following presenters to go as quickly as they reasonably can. Let's first of all take our quick break now. Let's just take a short 3-minute break, use the restroom, grab some more coffee, and let's meet back in just a few minutes and get rolling again. All right, let's all come back together, and we are about to dive into the real meat of the research, and I am very pleased to introduce you to Dr. Luis Pardo. Dr. Pardo was one of probably the very first KCNH1 researcher I got in contact with after a long rabbit trail of emails. And he was described to me as the world's expert in KV 10.1. And he has just been such a great support, so invested. He has shown up to every meeting, and we are so lucky to have his depth of knowledge on the channel. So thank you, Dr. Pardo.
So I'm going to share my screen then. Can you see it?
Yes, we can. Looks great. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I mean, it's very special for me to be able to participate in this meeting, and for a basic scientist like I am, it is really important to really get the idea that what we do at the end of the day might even have some kind of, I mean, could be useful for the well-being of actual people. I have a presentation with many data slides and a classical a classical scientific presentation, but I just want to give an impression of the complexity and the features of the particular channel. So I'm probably going to mention KB10.1 more often than KCNH1. I tried to edit my slides, but that's the way I typically call the channel, because that's how we work on it. I bring this slide of structure similar to what Ethan was presenting before, just to highlight the idea that what makes the channel a channel, right? So this permeation of potassium ions between both sides of the membrane in response to electrical stimuli is done by this small, well, relatively small part of the molecule, and all these bunch of protein in the intercellular side is, I mean, participates in modulating the gating of the channel. It participates in many things, but this gives an idea of that this protein is doing its function as a channel in a very tightly regulated and modulated way. So we came to study this channel from the biophysics point of view, because it's a very interesting protein, and it is expressed very abundantly in the human brain. And here there are some images of expressions of the dark signal is where the channel is expressed, and as you can see, the neurons are strongly stained for expression of the channel in many areas of the brain. And when we looked at the expression in the rest of the body, unlike most other ion channels, what we found is that the channel is expressed essentially only in the brain. So actually it's not expressed in the heart, as it was mentioned before, or we don't detect it in the heart. But so it is a very classical neuronal channel. But then we generated a mouse model that doesn't have any expression of the channel, and to our surprise, the mouse didn't have any sort of phenotype. So it survived perfectly without any copies of the channel. And that's because the neuronal function of the channel is rather subtle, so to say. So in the mice where we have removed the channel completely, if we measure synaptic transmission between, well, in the cerebellum between two types of cells, the granule cells and the Purkinje, and we look at the response in the Purkinje cell, and what we need to do to see any changes in the behavior of the cells, in the response of the cells, is stimulating the cells with relatively high frequency, so a stimuli with 50 hertz. And what happens in wild-type cells is that the response to the first stimulus is small, but then it increases and it stays there then for as long as we keep stimulating. The knockout mice, or where we have deleted completely the channel, have lost the possibility of controlling the amplitude of these responses and keep increasing. So what we got was hyperexcitability detected, but only under stress conditions, so not in normal conditions. The reason for this is actually we understand it relatively well, and it's just because of the biophysics of the channel. And what I want to mention here is that the good thing of studying or trying to understand the behavior of ion channels is that we can detect their activity with very high accuracy. So I mean, we are measuring the activity of the channel. We are seeing the flow of potassium through the channel in real time. But while we were doing this, we realized that the cells that we use, the transfected cells that we use to measure and determine the function of the channel grew faster than the rest of our cells. And this brought us to what has been the center of our work for many years, which is that the observation that the channel is expressed, as I mentioned, it's not expressed in peripheral tissues, but it's expressed in 70% of human tumors of, it doesn't matter of what origin. I think it is important to mention in this context that the channel is not an oncogene, and this would be, just a depiction of that. So if we overexpress the channel in the mammary gland of mice and under the control of a mammary gland specific promoter, what we get is are differences in the structure of the mammary gland. So this would be a whole mount of the mammary gland. This would be the mammary ducts, and you see that the wild type has smoother and less branched and less branched ducts than the transgene has. So, but we don't find the induction of tumors, right? So the channel is not an oncogene, but it probably confers a selective advantage. Its expression probably confers a selective advantage to cells expressing the channel. So this brought us to the idea that, well, it might be that it has, that we can make use of the expression of the channel as a prognosis or even therapeutic factor. And well, we can use it as a prognostic factor because the outcome of patients expressing high amounts of the channel in their tumors, in this case, I'm showing leukemia patients and some oral carcinomas, but in red, the survival of the patients expressing high amounts of the channel is less, it's shorter than the survival of patients expressing low amounts of the channel in both these tumor types, and there are others. But what was sort of relevant for us is that when we did a prospective study, a retrospective study in brain metastasis patients that had been treated with antidepressants, because we know that many antidepressants block the channel. When the patients had been treated with antidepressants that do not block the channel, they had less survival, they had worse prognosis than when they were treated with antidepressants that do block the channel. So this would say that then blocking the channel would remove the selective advantage and improve the outcome. And that is the reason, and now we are working stronger on that we are trying to find better blockers of KB10.1. In principle, we were completely concentrated on tumor cells. Now we have other priorities, but in any case, we keep trying to synthesize better blockers, more potent blockers, and we have generated a series of blockers that can, that have the same effect at lower concentration than the molecule we started with, but we are still facing a big problem, which is that a cardiac channel, which is a cardiac channel that is sort of dangerous to block, which is the HERG channel, that I think Ethan also mentioned, that is still blocked more efficiently than KCNH1. So we are still dealing with that. But being absolutely specific, we could show that blocking specifically the channel with antibody that we generated, that is a functional antibody that binds to outside the channel and stops its function, we reduce the progression of tumors or of tumor cells coming from patients. So developing potent and safe KB10.1 inhibitors will not only be relevant for these kids, but also for a large population, which could have important implications. I mean, just to mention it because so we decided to move to a different approach, which is instead of blocking directly the channel, using the expression of the channel, which as I mentioned is not detectable in outside of the say it. It's not detectable outside the brain to mark tumors, and we have generated some strategies to kill tumor cells. I'm going to jump over this for the sake of time, but to kill tumor cells efficiently just by using the expression of the channel as a marker for the tumor. So here in green we are detecting the death of these cells. But all this brings us to something which is important not only for tumors, but also for KCNH1 channelopathies, which is that, I mean, if this is a neuronal channel, okay, we have a neuronal phenotype, but why do we have so many other manifestations of the condition? So why are there, I don't know, nail abnormalities, right? And so we are trying to understand the cell biology of the channel. And one thing that we have found is that the against what we believed in the beginning, KCNH1 is expressed not only in neurons, but essentially on every cell that we have looked at, but only during a very short time period during the cell division. So a cell that's not dividing, then it won't express the channel, but if it is dividing, then during a short period of time, so the channel is detectable. And so this happens also in normal human tissues. But trying to understand the cell biology, then, well, that's where it would be expressed. Oh, yeah, and then, so this is the reason why we don't see the channel expressed in normal tissues. It's because most of the cells are not dividing at any given point when we test them. But in any case, along the path of trying to understand what the channel is doing in the tumor in the tumor cells, so why it represents an advantage for tumor cells, we found that, I mean, so there are a lot of different features of the tumor which are altered when we manipulate the channel expression, right? But we found that all those features depend on two things: on cytoskeleton rearrangements and on the intracellular calcium concentration. So the current work that we are doing is oriented to define the interaction of KB10.1 or of the channel with the microtubuli. I'm jumping over this because we are so short of time. But one thing which is important, and we will hear more about that, I think, in some minutes, is that one of these cytoskeletal and calcium-dependent events that KCNH1 is implicated in is the primary cilium homeostasis. The primary cilium are signaling hubs present in essentially every cell which is not dividing, and they need to be resolved when the cell is committed for division. What happens is that the expression of KB10.1 during that particular time, which is the time of the division when the channel is expressed, will then slow down we will facilitate the retraction of the primary cilium. And the reason why I think this is important is because there is a set of conditions which are called ciliopathies, which have in common an alteration in the homeostasis of the primary cilia, and they coincide with KCNH1 channelopathies, in that they have very similar morphological alterations in terms of the alterations of the face and alteration of the digits. So I mean, we have some evidence, and as I said, Dr. Caputo will talk more about that. But we have evidence that one of the reasons of the developmental problems that these children have is because they have altered coelogenesis. But the good news is that we can correct the altered coelogenesis by pharmacological intervention. So just for, as a summary, the physiology of KCNH1 is, well, and it is regulating the excitability of neurons, but in somatic cells through cytoskeletal interactions and calcium homeostasis, it participates in a large number of functions. So when we have a gain of function mutation, we are affecting the excitability, and at the same time, we are probably affecting coelogenesis. So it would be in principle possible to correct both things if we act early enough. What would happen in a cancer cell is that they lose this cell cycle dependent expression, so they have a sustained expression of the channel, which then accelerates all these processes and gives the cell more chances to survive. And with this, and just thank you. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to try to answer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pardo, for your fascinating work. We've gotten several questions about the link between KCNH1 and cancer. I think those last two slides kind of clarified that they're quite different mechanisms of action, but given that our kids have gain of function, mostly mutations, and cancer progression is linked to an overexpression of the gene, is there a potential for our kids to have a higher risk of cancer?
No,
or some connection with a family history of cancer?
Okay, that's why I insisted on the mammary gland slide. So the channel is not an oncogene, so it does not increase the risk of having cancer. It might be the case that once there is a cancer, then one should keep an eye on a potential worse prognosis because of the expression of the channel. But the difference that I think is important to highlight is that in tumor cells, what's lost is this cyclic regulation of the expression of the channel in non-neuronal cells. And what happens so for the kids, they have regulated expression, but only that when the channel is open, it simply opens earlier, right? So that's so I mean, if so in an individual not carrying a tumor, I don't think there is an increased risk of having cancer.
Okay, I imagine that's pretty reassuring. Thank you so much for that clarification. I think we're going to go ahead and show the second set of family videos now.
Hi guys, my name is Karen and this is my 8-year-old son, Bentley. Bentley was diagnosed with Zimmerman-Leban syndrome back in 2015, a mutation in the KCNH1 gene. I would say that something funny and unique about Bentley is his ability to give the world's best side eye or stink eye. You know, he makes it known that we live in his world and the world revolves around him in our household. And I think that's what makes him unique, is that he is his own person. He has such funny traits to him, apart from being as quiet and as serious as he seems to always be. I would say that the most difficult part of having a child with this disability is the unknown of what, you know, the next hour may look like or the next day. I think not knowing what the future truly holds for them is probably the most difficult thing for us. With so little known and so little information out there, we've come to realize that, you know, we are the ones that are going to help families down the road. And it's satisfying to know that, but it's sad in a way that, you know, for us, we're living in this uncertainty. And you know, Bentley could have just, you know, a wonderful start to his day like he did today. A little bit tired because he decided that he was going to stay up all night, to, you know, having a full-blown grand mal seizure this morning, which is very scary, very traumatic. But we do our best to make sure that Bentley feels loved, that he feels love not just from us, but all our extended family and our friends. And I believe in my heart that he feels the love from everyone that he comes in contact with, and that brings so much joy to us. You know, in the future, if there were treatments or medications that could further help him, I think our desires, our dreams for him would, number one, be to control his seizures 100%. We were very fortunate to go a little over 5 years with absolutely no seizures. But when they came on very strong. And it's something that we don't deal with on a daily basis, but it is something that we have seen pick up in frequency over the last 3 years. So if we could eliminate seizures altogether, that would be a dream. Our hopes for the future and with future treatments are for Bentley to have cognitive growth. You know, Bentley does not walk. He depends on us 100% for lifting. And I think for us, we're okay with that, as long as there's some cognitive growth. We would love to see cognitive growth in him. To us, it's more important to have that cognitive ability than physical abilities. So if treatments could help with that, that would be a dream come true. But overall, Bentley is a very fortunate and lucky little boy, and we are very grateful for him, and our hopes for him are that he continues to feel that love and that we are able to provide him the quality of life that we feel that he needs and deserves, and that's all that we could ever ask for.
Hello, this is Joseph. Joseph is 24 years old and he's the oldest in our KCNH1 community. He is generally a happy, healthy boy. Here he's getting ready to go off to the day centre this morning, just waiting for the bus. We live in Brighton in the south of England. Joseph's favourite things are being out and about. He likes going to parks and woods and places where he can look at trees and green things. So we're now in the park in the rain, and Joseph's doing what he likes to do. He's walking around at his own pace, which may be fast and it may be slow. Hi Joseph. And he's looking at the plants and the trees, and he's trying to catch up with me because he'd rather be holding my hand. KCNH1 affects everything about Joseph. It makes him who he is. And it affects obviously everything about our lives as well. Our lives as a family are maybe not what we thought they would be when we had our little boy all those years ago. I think if we should turn around and you can see his face again. I think if we could change anything or improve any one thing, it would really be about communication, because that's really what's hardest for Joseph, I think, that he can't tell us what he wants, and he doesn't really understand what we're trying to do sometimes, or what we would what we would like for him. But I think he knows that we love him very much, and we try and make sure he has as much fun as possible. And that's us. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hazel, and I have KCNH1.
Hazel was born on May 8th, 2016, and after a pretty typical infancy, she was diagnosed with epilepsy at about 18 months.
You sometimes have epilepsy. Sometimes I have seizures that scare.
How does that make you feel?
And sometimes it makes my brain feel funny before having one. And sometimes after having a seizure, it makes me tired.
We've struggled with seizure control over the years, though she did go from 3 to 4.5 without any seizures. They've really increased over her school, as that seems to be a trigger for her. And up until September of this year, that was her only diagnosis. Besides that, she also has severe ADHD. And with the genetic testing, we discovered that she has KCNH1 mutation.
And my brain sends a message to my mouth that my mouth doesn't get.
She does have hard days, and she is often a step or two behind her friends and her peers, but for the most part, she smiles in the face of adversity. She is 100% unapologetically herself, and she is a firecracker. We're so proud of who she is, and we wouldn't change her for the world.
And to be different is what makes us special.
Thank you again to all the families who sent in videos. I think it's really amazing to see the spectrum of how KCNH1 mutations affect all of our kids differently, and I just appreciate the time everyone took to make those videos. Okay, next up we have Dr. Kearney, and I haven't actually had the chance to really meet Dr. Kearney yet, but she's basically my hero since she has agreed to make us a KCNH1 mouse. So I can't wait to hear all about the plans, and thank you so much for taking on this project.
And thank you so much for having me. It's really, as Wendy said at the very beginning, it's a partnership between the basic research labs and the families. You really help us move forward and keep us focused on the important stuff. So can everybody see my slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Get my laser pointer. And just in full disclosure, this is going to be mostly aspirational because we have just transitioned into making a mouse model for KCNH1. So why do we want to do this? What's the value of having an animal model? Most importantly, it provides us access to a developing or a fully developed brain. So we get the whole tissue. And that allows us to study the impact of these pathogenic variants on biology at multiple levels of analysis. So we can look at individual neurons, like Dr. George was talking about, the iPSC-derived neurons, but we can also go further and look at synapses, circuits, networks, and the entire system. So both the brain and the body working together. In addition, it's a dynamic system where we can look at the evolution of symptoms over time. And we can also look at treatment response over time. If a treatment has a honeymoon period, but then wanes, we can model that in the animals. We can identify biomarkers of disease progression and look at treatment response with those biomarkers. We can hopefully identify and provide additional evidence for therapeutic targets. And we can help prioritize novel candidate drugs for future clinical trials. If there are 5 analogs in development, the animal models can help pick which one to move forward. And importantly, we can also help evaluate safety. So if we look at Dravet syndrome, which is another rare developmental and epileptic encephalopathy that has been on the scene for a longer time. There have been animal models developed, including one in my lab, but there have been zebrafish and mouse models developed in other labs as well. And importantly, there's a very good preclinical to clinical translational track record for seizures and epilepsy. So we can use seizures as a measurement in the animals, and then that translates often pretty well to what happens in clinical situations. So there are a number of different medications that have been in development for Dravet syndrome. They're just shown here in these bar plots, and they're at various stages of development, including 3 that have been approved in the last 4 years. And there are also disease-modifying therapies like ASOs and gene therapies. And for every one of these drugs in the pipeline, there have been animal models that provided some of the evidence to move them into the clinic. So we have been making mouse models for neurodevelopmental channelopathies as part of the Center Without Walls that Dr. George talked about. He's actually my neighbor at Northwestern. And so we take the electrophysiology data and make decisions about which models to make. But essentially, we go from the clinical genetics from patients, identify the mutation, and then we can introduce that mutation to the same position in the mouse gene. And this really works because human and mouse KCNH1, their amino acid sequence, so the letters that make up the protein, are 97% identical between human and mouse. So really, there are very few changes. And then, as I said, we can study the brain, we can study neurons, we can study the whole animal, and we can also take neurons out. We can study those neurons in a slice that lets us study circuits. So it's a versatile system. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to pick which variants to study. We can't make all of the variants because it's inexpensive and lengthy process. So what we want to think about is representing major categories of the clinical spectrum, representing major categories of channel dysfunction, and that's where that high throughput electrophysiology data can help us group things into different types of alterations. For instance, altered gating, where the channel may open too soon. We also, at least initially, tend to pick recurrent variants because that represents a broader spectrum of individuals. And it also gives us more confidence that that particular variant is disease causing. Ideally, there would be an iPSC line available because these are 2 complementary model systems that can really help inform one another. And then we try to make unique variants that haven't been modeled by other groups. So we know that there's the existing knockout model that Dr. Pardo talked about. And in addition, there's also a knock-in mouse model that was made by Dr. Simons. That's isoleucine 494 valine. So we don't want to duplicate effort and make the same things. So the variant that we decided to go forward with first is R357Q, which is that most recurrent variant that has altered channel gating. And this is the same slide that Dr. George showed that just shows you that this doesn't have, in fact, in the red, have a very profound effect on channel function. So we use CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing. And what that allows us to do is we go into the mouse gene and we just change that one nucleotide from, in this case, from a G to an A. And that is exactly the same variant that happens in the patients. And so we're not making any other additional changes to the genome, hopefully. And so we have done this step so far. We had our first batch of animals born last week. And in another week or two, we'll start the process of molecular validation. So what that means is we go in and check and make sure that we did this and that we also didn't do any other changes. So we screen for predicted off-target sites. CRISPR-Cas9 has sort of predictable off-target effects sometimes. And the way that we've been doing that recently is we just do whole genome resequencing of the founder mice and just make sure that we're not propagating something where we have other issues beyond that single nucleotide variant, because that's all that we want to see. So for animal models, there's kind of there are pillars of model validation. One is construct validity. So is the underlying cause the same? And certainly for a genetic variant, that's pretty straightforward. We're introducing the same variant. So we can check that box. Space validity talks about does the phenotype resemble what you see in patients? And predictive validity is, do you see a similar treatment response? So if we think about face validity, one of the first things that we do when we have a new mouse model is we approach it similar to clinical genetics, and we just examine body morphology. Is there anything noticeable in terms of the body? We can look at various measurements of the skull or the brain or jaw. And this is an example over here of a mouse model that's called koala that has a characteristic craniofacial phenotype, as well as hairy ears. So it's very easy when you're used to looking at mice all the time to see these differences in morphology. We can also look at the digits. So we could look at sort of those distal ends of what in the mice would not be the ends of the paws, not the hands, but there's also a nail bed. So we can look for these characteristic morphological features. The other thing that my lab spends a lot of time doing is EEG. So seizures and epilepsy are an important facet of phenotyping. And see if this video will play. I think it's playing. So this is a mouse with a different potassium channel variant that's having a seizure. You can see that that's pretty obvious. But we also do EEG, just like you would do clinically, to see an electrographic component of that. And the other thing that we want to look at is the background EEG. And Dr. Gertler talked about this earlier, that you see changes in background EEG in developmental encephalopathies. And this again is from a different potassium channel variant where we can see profound changes in the background EEG. Here we have lots of spiking in changes in the background rhythms. We can also look at various neurobehavioral assays and look at things like learning and memory, anxiety, motor function, social behavior. There's also things for vocalization. And this is really where we rely on families to inform us of what things we should be going and looking at. So then the last piece of the puzzle is predictive validity. So do the drugs that work in patients work in the mice? That's straightforward when you have drugs that work. It's a little bit trickier when you have a rare disease where there aren't really great treatments. So we, in this case, can rely on things where there might be a partial effect, or if there are things that cause worsening, that's certainly something that can help us benchmark predictive validity so that we know that we can move ahead and look for efficacy of novel drugs. So finally, the last thing that we do, and that is a core value of my lab, and I think it's probably the most important thing we do, is we share our resources. So for instance, the Dravet syndrome mouse model, we deposited that at the Jackson lab where any researcher can go ahead and order it. And what that really does is give you a force multiplier effect. So we published that mouse model in 2014. And if we look at cumulative publications over time, so dissemination of the information, all these, the hashed part of the bar are studies that we either initiated ourselves or contributed to. But the filled part of the bar without the hash is studies that use our mouse model, but we had nothing to do with them other than depositing the mice. And so you can see that there's a great acceleration of the research with this sharing. So finally, I just want to acknowledge people in my lab, and particularly Chris Thompson and Al George, who provided me with the R357Q as the front runner for putting into the mice, and the folks in our transgenic core and our funding sources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kearney. We will all be watching with great interest as you pursue the project. I would like to introduce now Dr. Terry Jo Bichelle. Dr. Bichelle is a real force within the rare disease community. She saw unmet needs and systemic issues, and she decided to take them on. And Cure KCNH1 just recently joined Combined Brain, but every meeting I've been to, it's like, yes, thank goodness someone is working on this and I don't have to do it all myself. So I am very pleased to have her share a bit more about how valuable and pivotal patient data can be in advancing the research.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I've really been enjoying the meeting and learning a lot more about KCNH1. We're so happy that you all have joined Combined Brain. So I'm here to talk today about how natural history is power. And in fact, natural history is the rare patient's most valuable resource. For the patients of, for the families of patients who have rare diseases, what you have that everyone needs is information. You know more about your life and the disease that your family member is suffering from than anybody else in the world, and that is power. So Combined Brain is an organization of nonprofit organizations, and we work to help everybody work together to fast track treatments and potentially cures for all of these disorders. We focus on rare genetic neurodevelopmental conditions. So what I tell everyone is this is sort of a mock-up of the timeline from discovering a gene to getting an FDA drug, to getting a drug approved by the FDA. And so what you have to do in this timeline is, and you've already gotten a lot of it done, your community is doing a fantastic job. So you ID the gene. It gives a real leg up once you know what the gene is, because then you can look at mechanisms and you can really make sure that you have patients who actually have the same disorder included in studies. You work on your rodent and cell models, and we just heard from Dr. Kearney, and you all have a lot of fantastic work going on in that realm already. You need to collect natural history, meaning collect information from people who actually have the disorder or from their family members. And then while you're doing that, you try to understand what the mechanisms are behind the gene mutations that cause the symptoms that you're seeing in the families. And I've already heard today some great presentations from clinicians who are collecting that kind of information and researchers who are looking for the mechanisms. Then you need to work on disease concept studies and disease burden studies, and that's a whole nother topic. And then hopefully that will help you lead to biomarkers. All of this will help you choose the right patient-centered outcome measures that you can then use in clinical trials. So if you look at this slide, everything above the line are things that family members and foundations really need to work hard on. They are the things that are absolutely crucial to have families and foundations involved in. Everything below the line is usually what you have researchers and industry working on, but the whole thing goes back and forth, up and down below, up above the line to down below, and back and forth the whole time. So you'll be giving natural history information to all the researchers who are working on projects below the line, and then vice versa. They'll have to give it back to you. So in a nutshell, we have had a lot of trials fail in the field of genetic neurodevelopmental disorders. And one of the reasons these drug trials have failed is because we concentrated on the symptoms of the poor rodents rather than what families and people were experiencing. We found what we could measure in rodents, then we decided what we should look at in these clinical trials. Then we measured those things in the clinical trials, and then we weren't able to show efficacy. That happened with Fragile X, that's happened with several different trials. But now, partially because of a push by the FDA, patients are at the center of clinical trial development. And so instead of measuring what matters to rodents, we need to measure what matters to people and what matters to patients and their families. And then we need to collect information about what matters to patients and their families. And then we need to figure out what can be measured in the rodent models that really derives from what the patients care about. Then that leads to the right endpoints that we can use in clinical trials, and hopefully that will lead to successful clinical trials. So in your field, in the field of your disorder, you've already gotten a lot of work done. And it started with the power of the first patient back in 1991, when the first case study was published about Temple-Baratzer syndrome. And that was a powerful thing because it put it in the map and it put it on people's radar, so that then when you have 6 more patients, there's even more power. You can now look at those 6 patients, decide what they have in common, and identify the gene and the gene mutation behind those symptoms. That's a lot of power wielded because of information collected about 6 patients. Imagine the power of 27 patients, which at this point, you've already been collecting information, case reports and case studies on 27 patients and more. If you look at other other manifestations of and symptoms of what KCNH1 mutations can cause, this gives you even more power. You can try to figure out exactly what the gene does, exactly why some people may have different symptoms than other people, which mutations in which part of the gene cause which symptoms. These are the kind of things you can start to understand when you have enough information about enough patients. And so at this point now, this brand new paper that just came out, it's really powerful because you can now look all the way across the gene and try to understand really what the gene is doing, what the mutations are doing, why the different symptoms are being shown by different patients. So that's all very important. Powerful information collected in distinct moments in these families and these patients' lives. But even more powerful is information collected over time. Not just a one point case study, but information about the same patient collected on a regular basis over the years. How does that one patient's life unfold? And what the FDA has said is that this information contributes to really being able to understand a disease and what we need to treat in a specific disease. So I want to just mention the difference between a registry and natural history. A registry is a point in time, and registries are very important. Everything I just showed you that was published in those case studies, those were really from single time points. I mean, some of those patients had been seen by the clinicians who published the papers more than one time, but in general, those are single time points. A registry is in general a single time point. And if you only fill in the surveys from a registry one time, that's still good. That's better than nothing. But imagine if you can fill out those registries over the long time of a person's life. You can ask things about when were seizures identified? How did they start? What treatments are going to work the best? Will certain medicines work better than others? Did the seizures respond to certain medicines for a short period, but then stop responding? Did a combination of medicines work better? Did gross motor skills develop? When did the child hit certain milestones? What affected those milestones? Will the child learn to speak? What helped the child learn to speak? These are all things that you can learn over a longitudinal study, which would be a real natural history study. So the definition of natural history is really gathering information about how a disease affects a person over a lifetime. And so this means gathering information whether you're treated or not, whether there's a cure or not, whether there's a treatment or not. We just want to know what your life is like, what the child with the disorder's life is like, or the adult with the disorder's life is like over time. And this information can be entered either by a physician or a clinician or a healthcare provider, or it can be entered by a patient or a parent or family member of a person. All of that data is really important and really valuable. So what are some of the things that you can get out of natural history studies? Oh my gosh, so much. You might not realize how rich that information is. You can start to understand the disorder in a really full way. Catalog the symptoms, catalog the treatments. What are some people trying in some countries that maybe other countries haven't even tried yet? Record the quality of life. What is it that affects the quality of life the most? Is it communication? Is it motor skills? We heard from some of the family videos today that some people just wanted to hear the words, I love you. Some people just wanted the child to be able to communicate, even if they could never actually walk or move. I mean, we need to understand, what is it that affects quality of life the most in your family? And then you can inform researchers about all these subtleties. What is it about that they really need to be focusing on? What would a treatment really, how could a treatment help you the most? And then we could figure out how to track whether treatment's working or not. So if a treatment helps in some way, but it doesn't help in another way, that might be really important to know. We don't want a drug to fail because it only helped the child communicate, but it didn't help them walk. We don't want a drug to fail because it only reduced because it didn't reduce seizures, but it did help the child communicate. So we need to be able to track treatment effectiveness in all these different ways. And then also you can use natural history to develop standard of care. So what that means is that you could actually have a specific way that any doctor around the world would be able to treat people with the mutation. So if they have a kid, a patient, or an adult with the mutation in their caseload, they could look up online, what's the best seizure treatment? What's the best therapy to use? All of those things can come out of a natural history trial. And also the timeline for a disorder. When is it that seizures hit for the most part, depending on the mutation? Or when is it that milestones hit, for example? And that can help figure out, when do you actually have to treat? So at what age is it the most important to treat the child to prevent the most severe symptoms? So these are all important things that can come out of natural history. And also you can come up with new biomarkers. So you could actually, if once you have the description of the timeline of a disorder, you can actually look for biomarkers, maybe in blood, maybe in cerebrospinal, maybe in EEGs, maybe in MRIs, that could actually show whether the child is getting worse or better according to treatment or just through natural history. And then what's really cool is a natural control group. So I think if my slide will advance, there we go. I'll be able to tell you about that. And I saw one of the previous speakers use the same slide, borrowed from the Test Foundation. And what this shows is that if you have really good natural history, really well recorded, really to a standard that the FDA can accept the data, then you might be able to use the natural history as a control group in addition to or instead of a placebo. So a lot of times when we have clinical trials, families really are worried about participating because they don't want their child to be one of the ones on a placebo. And nobody really wants to be on a placebo because we want to try a drug to see if it really works. And so what you want to do is reduce the number of kids that have to be on a placebo. And one of the ways you can do that is by increasing the caliber of the quality of your natural history data. So what would happen is, if you look at this graph right here, if you, or here, let's start with this graph. If you look at a placebo group and you count the number of symptoms, you can see that the placebo group is developing more symptoms than the group that's treated, in which case this treatment ought to be recommended because it's reduced the number of symptoms. Well, you could do the same thing with natural history if you just show that the treated group is actually not developing as many symptoms as you would expect just from collecting natural history. And this has already been done. In the case of spinal muscular atrophy, which is a very severe disorder, it has several different types of SMA, and the most severe types result in they're fatal and very, very severe. And then there's a second severe type that is also eventually fatal, but not quite as quickly as the most severe. And then there are other types that result in sort of pretty severe motor issues, but they are not fatal. And so they used in the trials for spinal muscular atrophy, natural history as a control. Part of that was because the families and the organizations working with spinal muscular atrophy had done a really good job at collecting natural history so that they could actually predict which group, type 1 that was the worst, or type 2 or type 3 or type 4, which group would the person be in. And then they could also predict absolutely when they needed to give the treatment, when was the best window to prevent the worst parts of the disorder. So this is not just a dream. This has actually been done. And SMA now has so many treatments, gene therapies, antisense oligos, compounds that can actually, they're completely life-changing for people with SMA. This is another example of natural history being used as a control for SMA, and they were looking at the number of fatalities of people with SMA experienced up to the age of 14 months. And they were also able to look at the number of times people had to be put on a ventilator. And what they could see is that people who were on the drug, which is this green line here, were able to avoid those events, those being put on a ventilator, and survive so much obviously better than people who had not had the treatment. And that was not people on placebo. Those were people who had been collected in natural history trials. And then this is my own example. This is a picture of my son down on the bottom right. He's an adult with Angelman syndrome, and this is how I got involved in the field of rare genetic neurodevelopmental disorders. And we've collected a lot of natural history for Angelman syndrome. And I'm very proud to tell you that one of these little red lines right here is my son. And his being one of these little red lines has a huge contribution to the field, because what we know is that if you have a certain kind of mutation that causes Angelman syndrome, we expect that your cognition and your receptive communication and your expressive communication, see down here in all this red fuzzy stuff, is going to be at a pretty reduced level compared to the people who have another kind of mutation and compared to the control group. And so frankly, if my son from a treatment were able to rise up to this ability level up in the blue section, which is a different type of mutation, I would be very happy, and it would improve our life a huge amount. And so this information is information that we can use in clinical trials for Angelman for my own son. And so now I'm almost done. And what I'm going to tell you is that natural history is a big hassle. It's a big hassle. This is my business. This is what I do for a living. And I have a hard time filling out all those surveys. It's a pain. We already have complicated lives when we live with a kid with a neurodevelopmental disorder. We've already got to juggle medications and caregivers and feeding and toileting and sleep and all that other stuff. Who has time to fill out these ridiculous surveys? And sometimes they ask me the same questions over and over. It drives me nuts. And sometimes they ask me questions that really are not relevant to my kid. And it's aggravating and it's frustrating. And I see no benefit in the short run. So why should I do it? Because it's the most powerful thing I can do to help my kid and other people with his disorder. And I'm a crier, so don't worry about me. I always cry. But the thing is, I'm telling you, natural history is a pain. And it is the most important thing you can do. The power is really in your hands to cure KCNH1. And that's all I've got to say.
I got distracted typing you a message just saying you're amazing, standing ovation. Thank you for being real and honest and letting us know the power and the pain of collecting this data. I really appreciate your time. I have a special surprise guest, which I should have mentioned at the very top. And it is Effie Parks. Hi, Effie. And Effie is a podcaster extraordinaire. She's pretty much become the voice of the rare disease community. I think you have done just massive amounts to bring the community together and educate everyone and help foster those connections and the support system. The information you share and the resources are just fantastic. And so I am very pleased to let Effie close us up.
Hey, Michelle, thank you so much for inviting me. I love you so much, and you're just an Energizer bunny with the biggest smile on your face all the time. I am also a crier, Terry Joe, so how dare you? I was telling myself all morning, Effie, you're not gonna cry even a little, and then there she goes. Anyways, thank you for that really powerful talk, Terry. I'm gonna steal some of that and share it with my own community. I really appreciate it. Anyways, thank you so much. Like Michelle said, my name's Effie Parks. I'm also a rare disease mom, and I host a podcast called Once Upon a Gene for our rare disease community. And, you know, as members of this rare disease community, it can be so easy to feel lost, helpless. Sometimes it kind of feels like it's our default state, doesn't it? We're suddenly parents in a way that we never expected, doing things that we never could have imagined. And then finally, that dreaded day that we needed so much, diagnosis day, D-Day. It's a day we wake up and we're lost in a world with no answers again. And we're lost in a part of the world we've always been in, but we never really expected to visit. And by the end of that day, we're in this new reality, in a new place that we've never visited and we've never been to. But we have our diagnosis. And it's a world where the answers are there and we just have to find them. It's a world that feels isolated. We feel alone. But for those of us lucky enough to find our people, our community, we soon find out that that is not the truth. We're not alone. And we don't have to search for all of these answers alone. That community, the structure and support it can provide is valuable beyond measure. And it's what you have at this conference, in each other. But there's only so much that we as everyday people feel like we can do. That's where the incredible people we all just heard from this morning come in. That's what the scientists and doctors and researchers we heard from really are. They're the pathfinders, they're the explorers that expand this new world that we're in. And they shed light on the darkest parts of this world that we're all afraid to venture into. and they help make this world known, and they help to make it ours. But as amazing as they are, they can't light our new world on their own. They need you, the citizens of your new world, to step into that light and make it a community, to make it not just a place where we have to live, but a place where we want to live, to make it a home, and we must help them discover our gifts, our abilities, our resources, and be of service in some way. And that's when something truly amazing can happen, when we own our space and when we light the dark and live proudly in our world. Because when we can do that, we can expand our borders, and we can search for the light, and we can find out that we're not alone. KCNH1 is not a dark, cut off place in the world on its own. We find out that we're all here together, the other members of the rare disease community, CTNNB1, SYNGAP1, FOXG1, SLC6A1, CDKL5, CACNA1A. They're just a town over, connected by science and people and hope. And we're all in this together. And when we unite, when we're more than this isolated pocket of people trying to find our way in the dark, but the rare disease community, we can find something else. And we find that we never left the world that we were born on, and we're still here on Earth. Even if the brainiacs you heard from all morning are so smart and they seem that they're actually aliens, the rare disease community is huge. And it is a community tempered by the fires of adversity, hardship, and grief. And it is a community lit by empathy, compassion, and hope. And it is a community that will change the world. So thank you, all of you, thank you, because today you woke up and you chose to engage in our community. And you chose to stare down your grief and to keep moving. You chose to learn. So today you chose to light the paths that are going to bring our world together. So keep it up, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Effie. I really appreciate you joining us on such short notice. It was an honor. It was really an honor to hear from everyone today. I am so, so pleased about how many people came together today to learn from each other. I loved Terry Jo's slide about how, or whoever it was, I think it was Terry Jo's, about how it goes back and forth. You know, the patients ship off the IPS, the blood samples to Al George, and then he provides information about how our kids' bodies are working, and it goes back and forth, and we can all truly build upon each other's strengths and push this research and hope forward as quickly as possible together. So we are going to transition now to the researcher roundtable discussion. Any of the participants who signed up as a researcher or doctor will get panelist privileges so we'll switch to a more Zoom meeting format. Any of the family members who would like to stay and observe, absolutely feel free. If everybody needs just like 1 or 2 minutes to go use the restroom or something, let's come back in as quickly as possible. Thank you. Okay, I hope that was long enough to get your drink of water. And everyone, please feel free to, it's been weird staring at a blank face all day. I'm not used to the webinar format. So please feel free to turn on your cameras if you're dressed. And so we would really love to facilitate a productive discussion. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. George.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, so Michelle asked me to moderate this research roundtable. In order to do that, I think it's helpful if everyone has a camera presence on the call, so we're having more of a conversation. I took some notes during the morning, and I put together one slide just as sort of to get us thinking about what we want to discuss. But I think give me a second here. I need to shift some things around on my computer screen. But just to give us a little sort of guidance as to what we might want to talk about. So this is just a slide, as you'll see in a moment, that just lists a few things that were brought up today in various contexts that I list here as topics. And they're not in any particular order. They're not ordered by any particular priority or preference. It's just, these are things that need to be talked about at some point. And then the question is how to prioritize things. I actually thought Terry Jo's slide, where she showed above the line were things that families need to be involved in, and below the line are things that primarily are the job of researchers. I thought that was very, very astute, and I would love to have that slide at some point. So anyway, here's just some things to think about. Some of them we just heard about from Terry Jo, which is clinical trial readiness and natural history studies. Certainly understanding the disease, which I label here as investigating the pathophysiology or the mechanism of the disease, is also important. How are we going to do that? Well, we need models. We need disease models, cell models, animal models, that sort of thing. An important question that I think is always raised with these types of neurodevelopmental disorders is the phenotype, the condition, reversible? And at what point or what age is it still reversible? And there's been some clever ways to assess that using mouse models that I'm aware of in some neurodevelopmental disorders. So that may be a topic to discuss. And then sort of pivoting to therapeutics, the idea of drug repurposing was discussed, led by Ethan, versus sort of a de novo drug discovery effort. And when drugs are to be tested for whether they are drug repurposing opportunities or new drug entities, where do you test them? Where do you test them first and second and third? Cell type, cell model, animal model, what does that look like? And then the whole emerging area of genetic types of therapies, ASOs, base editing, gene therapies. That's another topic I think that's very ripe for a little bit of discussion. And then one I think that kind of folds back to the very first topic, which is clinical trial readiness, but more importantly, clinical trial design. I think that what we've heard is that natural history data can supplant a placebo control arm in a placebo-controlled trial, but this is a really rare disease. It's not as common as something like Dravet syndrome, and where placebo-controlled trials were very successful. This is really rare. So I think some clever approaches to trial design need to be worked on. And then lastly, and certainly not least in its importance, what do you measure? What's the outcome? And how does that vary by individual? So anyway, I didn't list anything under priorities because I think that's partly the purpose of the conversation here. So the floor is open. I think there's no organization here other than people talking, and maybe we can just go around and hear from individuals as to what their take-home message was from today, and whether they think anything was not covered, and whether there's something really important that should be covered. So I'm looking at the chat box here. I don't think there's nothing that I'm using. So anyway, anybody, or I'll call on somebody. That's always a very uncomfortable thing to do. So I'll actually direct the first question, since we just heard from Terry Jo, and again, I think you made a very passionate statement, which is doing these natural history studies is a pain, very challenging, very difficult. Is there any strategy to make it less painful? I know you know Ann Berg well. I've worked with Ann for a few years, and she's done a lot of work with the Clearings database to try to make these online surveys less painful. What's on the horizon to try to make this, if KCNH1 starts a natural history study this year, what's the best formula to make that as least painful as possible?
Oh, that's a great question. There are a couple different tactics that we've been trying at Combined Brain. One is to make sure that the families get a report, or as quickly as possible get results from whatever tests are done on those on their kids, and that way they can hopefully have those and use them as they see fit. So if they have developmental testing, give them the report right away so that they can actually give that to their school or some other researcher. Make it possible for them to share the research elsewhere so they don't have to do the same exact thing over and over again. So that's one thing. Another thing that we've been trying really hard at Combined Brain is to find platforms and ways for daily information on it. So rather than just collecting information at set intervals, they can actually add information that you don't even know you need to collect. So for example, if a kid falls, they can enter into a program fell today. Or if a kid has bad behavior, they could enter bit someone today, or whatever it is. And then you can go back and look at that in relation to the seizures, or in relation to medication changes. And then over time, you as a research group can realize that, oh, falls are really important because we have 5 families collecting it. Or constipation is a big one. Nobody ever collects that information. And it turns out that's one of the big things that impacts people's lives. So if people can use the information on a daily basis, it keeps them engaged. And you don't have to just bug them once a year to fill out the form. Instead, you can help them use it for their own lives.
Now, am I on here? Yeah. Is there any kind of smartphone app that's been developed to enable that kind of daily data collection?
There are. So there are different ways to do this. So Simons collects the standardized surveys, which is fantastic. And then if you do the visits to the actual clinic to collect in-person assays, that's really important. But we work with another platform called the Matrix. The Matrix can collect that kind of daily information, and collect all the other stuff as well. There are also individual apps that you can use that have been known to be good enough to be put in CDISC format so they can be used for FDA trials. So those would be things like Seizure Tracker, that's from the Epilepsy Foundation. There are diet apps. There are a lot of different apps that can be used depending on what's important to your families and your trials.
And is there a place where this information about these tools has been aggregated to make it easier to learn about them?
Well, that's sort of what Combined Brain specializes in, and we're so excited that this group is now a part of Combined Brain so that they're new. So truthfully, I don't know enough about the disorder. We haven't done a draft conceptual model, which is something we usually do for each of our disorders. We're hoping to have an undergrad on that this semester to do our first draft so that we can start to understand the disorder a little better. And then we make recommendations after that about what we think would be really smart to collect based on what you all are already collecting, and then what hasn't been collected so far and what the families feel is really important.
So you're looking for an undergrad to do something.
Well, I teach translational neuroscience at Vanderbilt. And so what I do is I just assign an undergrad to each of the new disorders. And so we're going to have a speaker from your group coming up, I think, next week or the week after. I can't remember. And that launches the student into it. And then we take their little draft at the end of the semester and we assign it to one of our postdoctoral researchers, and they beef it up so that we know a little bit more about the disorder.
So I'll just mention that although I'm not in Nashville anymore, I mean, I was there for many years, there's an undergrad that had worked with us last summer who began to do some electrophysiology work on KCNH1, who just contacted me and said she can't come to the lab during the winter and spring quarters this year, but would like to do a remote research project. Is that somebody that could a remote project be done in tandem with a Vanderbilt undergrad?
Oh my gosh, fantastic. She could join my bevy of undergrads.
Yeah.
We'd love to take her on.
Yeah, I'll contact you and get her online. She's
This is why
very bright, hardworking student. So
fantastic. This is why you all do these conferences. So we'll do these kind of connections. So thank you so much.
that's good. There are some things in the chat. I'm sorry, I have to look to my other screen, so it looks like I'm not looking at the camera. Let me see. Yeah, there was a statement here, I think very interestingly, from Hans Schumann about do we need to get information about, well, I'll just summarize, drug metabolism profiles to inform about drug repurposing work. I think that's a really interesting question. And I'm curious if Hans is on the call. Can he elaborate on why he brought that up? I don't know who is on the call. There we go. Hans, if you unmute, you can just tell us where that came from.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so this comes from the work that I had done for many years in the modeling field, in silico modeling, on drug metabolism, and the experience that Tristan had with imipramine. It's a very difficult drug to dose, and what I'm trying to understand is are there things specific to the KCNH1 family that would make these kids fast metabolizers or slow metabolizers, things like that, which would help inform some of the drug repurposing and trying to find the right dose that's actually going to work. We know that kids in general, their liver is not the same as an adult liver. And given the developmental issues that some of these kids have, I just want to know, is that something that would be useful to collect to inform drug repurposing and natural history and say, hey, you know what? All of these kids are fast metabolizers. We don't know why, but they are. That's good information. And so I'm just trying to understand that. And the reason that I brought it up is because it seems like drug repurposing is the quickest way forward. All of these other paths have a long distance to go, and so any info on that side might be useful. And when I was listening to the conversations about collecting natural history and whatnot, that was one of the ones. I don't know if it really fits as natural history, but it was something that I was interested in, not only for one drug, but for any drug. And I just thought it'd be good information to find out if that's collected, if it's available, et cetera. So that's where I was coming from.
Yeah, it's a really astute point. And, again, I don't have any answers. I think that the approach to doing that could be challenging. It's kind of outside of routine clinical care. However, the resources for doing genetic testing of drug metabolizing pathways is becoming quite available. And in many cases, and I'm not sure this is the case for many families, but some families got a KCNH1 diagnosis because they had an exome sequencing test or a genome sequencing test. So the information about drug metabolizing enzymes and drug transporters and all their genetic variation is already collected. Someone has to dig it out, and I'm not sure how one would dig it out. Empirically defining drug metabolism as a phenotype would require some kind of standardized drug exposure. And I don't know that, again, I think that falls a little outside of routine clinical care. That said, again, there may be empiric observations about that, the dose given to a child was insufficient to get a therapeutic blood level, and that implies a rapid metabolism, where, independent of how it got there. So, I think that's an interesting point.
And one more comment on that is that many of these patients are already taking other therapeutics, and there is drug-drug interaction and inhibition and induction of the various P450 enzymes, et cetera. So it really, unfortunately, gets more and more complex, but I think it's going to have a really big impact on the repurposing side of the coin.
Yeah, it does really call for it does really highlight the importance of including a clinical pharmacologist in the discussions about drug repurposing, and maybe even have that as part of the clinical trial design. Extent medications need to be looked at for whether they are drug metabolizing enzyme inducers or inhibitors, because that may in fact affect drug dosing considerably. Unfortunately, most of those things are not
side
routine clinical
effects.
care.
Can I just share, since Tristan experienced probably most of this, I would guess that, that the gene pharmacogenetic testing is not probably a routine part, but we did pursue that for Tristan before starting on the imipramine, because we wanted to know what would be the best dose for a little guy like him, especially. And so I found that very helpful and reassuring to find out, oh, okay, so he is an intermediate slow metabolizer. So we should reduce the dose by 25%, which was the recommendation for that category. And then it was also, I'm not sure if anyone else in going in looked closely enough at his existing medications to recognize that his Prevacid that he was on also inhibits the hERG channel. And so when he did experience the prolonged QT, as after introducing, we got a baseline EKG, and then he did experience the prolonged QT after introducing the imipramine. But, thankfully we did recognize that there was that potential interaction effect. And we determined at that point to withdraw the Prevacid, since it didn't seem to be helping anyways. And that did return the QT back to a more comfortable level.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so perhaps pre-trial pharmacogenomic testing and also review of medication portfolios with a clinical pharmacologist should be kept in mind. So. Ethan is still on the call. I mean, Ethan, this is probably not something that's commonly done, I would think, in drug repurposing circles, is to do pharmacogenomic profiling. Have you encountered that?
It's a great question. I'm glad Hans brought it up. And I think this is channelopathies, I think, are going to be a place where this maybe becomes something of a standard, given your baseline of polypharmacology and the fact that we know that these class of drugs, like these tricyclics, have this intrinsic, polypharmacology where they're probably going to engage with these channels in some way or another. So I think it's something to, maybe that's a discrete research project of digging into the WES files and just pulling out all the CYP SNPs and then running some profile to get an assessment. I mean, 23andMe will tell you some amount of this information from those old arrays. So we definitely should be able to figure out a way to standardize this.
Yeah. Michelle, you said Tristan had some kind of genetic testing done for drug metabolism. And was that something that insurance paid for? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I had to jump through a couple hoops to get it covered, but the pediatrician wrote a prior auth, and it wasn't too much of a problem.
Okay.
But yes, I agree. Theoretically, we should be able to extract that from the West, but I'm not really sure how you would go about doing that.
Yeah, it's not trivial. I mean, again, and companies are in the business of selling the data, and if they haven't mined it already, someone will have to mine it, and they may charge for that. So anyway, you'll see chats. Peter, you have your hand up. I'm sorry I didn't see it, but please go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your.
Yeah. So no, I just wanted to add to the conversation that just beyond also metabolizing speeds, there are just differences in the physiology of drug uptake between adults and children. And most of the patients here are children. And I know this because I'm from Holger Lerches group in Tübingen, and we recently, ran this study for KCNH1 patients. And what we learned was that we had to increase the dose tenfold in comparison to the adult population in order to reach similar levels in the serum. So I think also just, adding to general drug repurposing trials, this metabolizing thing is nice, but I think you still have to measure the concentration of the drug actually in the serum itself, because there's more going on in children physiology than just like zip enzymes.
Do you have any ideas about what is causing? I'm just curious because that exact thing happened to Tristan. We introduced a certain dose, we tested his serum levels, and they were undetectable. Even though theoretically they should have been reasonably high at that point. Increase the dose and still practically undetectable.
Well, we don't know. It's just that children are not just small humans, and you can't just take the dose that was calculated for an adult and that was proven to reach a certain serum concentration in an adult, and then say, okay, we adjust this now by weight, and then it will be the right dose to reach a given serum concentration. And I'm not sure whether actually there is any kind of help in these kinds of questions other than testing it.
Yeah, so the important thing is maybe empirically you must really determine blood levels and do pharmacokinetics in each clinical trial sample or case. Good point. Does anyone want to address the issue of phenotype reversibility? And again, the examples that I'm familiar with all involve mouse model studies. And Jennifer is probably familiar with the SCN2A story. There's also a SYNGAP story.
Yeah, and I think obviously step one is we would need to either make a conditional model, or the other thing is to reintroduce if we can reintroduce or overexpress wild type in knock-in. But certainly I think the other part of it to consider too is there may be some phenotypes that are reversible, and there may be some phenotypes that aren't necessarily reversible, but at least you plateau, and there may be others that it's the timing is off. So I think there might not be a single intervention window. It may be a variable intervention window depending on what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. It's not everything is going to be the same. So yeah, I think the reversibility experiments that I was most impressed with all involve these very complex mouse models where you have a mouse that has the gene knocked in at some point, the mutation knocked in, and then it can be reversed out later. That sounds challenging.
Yeah, we're starting to work on some of those for KCNB1, which is another voltage gated potassium channel gene that's similar to KCNH1. So yeah, but you're right, it's complicated, and there are certain mutations that are easier to do it for than others. So there's a little bit of selection that has to go into it.
Other types of animal models, again, I don't know that there's any need to think about other models other than a mouse, but there's been a trend to do things in, say, zebrafish, which may enable some in vivo drug screening, which is difficult to do in a mouse. And then beyond mouse, there is, I think there's been an effort in SynGap to make a SynGap rat, because the rats maybe have a little more robust behavioral phenotyping pathway. So any thoughts about that? Zebrafish or rat models?
Yeah, and there's also been a move to make some marmoset models for some of the neurodevelopmental disorders that lean more towards autism. So I mean, really, at the end of the day, what model you make depends on the question. And you're right, drug repurposing screen can be done with zebrafish pretty easily, as long as there's a nice correlation between one of the zebrafish genes and the human gene, which I'm not sure is as clear cut for KCNH1 as it has been for some other genes.
So I just want to talk about the reversibility issue a little bit. In the Angelman world, what we found is that certain phenotypes could be reversed completely if the gene was replaced very early on. But if the gene was replaced in the adolescent, you could not reverse motor skills or seizures, and nor some of the social issues. But even in the adult mouse model, you could still reverse the learning and memory markers. And for me, that's the holy grail. So I think we have to be really careful when we look at reversal in models where we can't measure all these subtle distinctions. And we also have to go back, like a broken record, to what the families care about.
Any other comments about phenotype reversibility? Yes, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hey, it's Matt Weston. I know it says Amy Shore, but I got an email from Michelle the other day. Said come to the conference. So I hopped on, saw some of the stuff. Nice data. I mean, I was just going to mention, in KCNT1, which I'm most familiar with, the Petro paper recently with the ASOs showed. I was shocked how good of reversibility of phenotypes they got with the ASOs, even treating mice that were day 40 at the P40 or something like that. So
yeah, so definitely can happen. And
yeah, I mean, that's closely related in some way. If you consider potassium channel mostly gain of function variants that you do. So yeah.
Can you remind me, that's a general knockdown ASO, is that right?
You mean it's not targeted to the variant? Yeah, it's just targeted to the gene.
Yeah.
Right.
Correct.
Wonderful.
Yeah, Matt, while you're on the call, I think the other question that probably needs to be answered at some point is which neuron subtype is driving the phenotype with KCNH1. And
yeah, I'd love to get involved in that. Yeah, I mean, I was shocked. I didn't know much about KCNH1, and then I got the email and I was trying to look at what's known about it, and I was shocked at how little, or at least I could find without a deep dive, is known about its role in neuronal physiology. So it seems like there's a lot to learn on that level.
Right. Yeah, and again, I think getting the right tools. Again, Jennifer Kearney is starting the work to make a mouse knock-in mouse one of the more recurrent mutations. So hopefully a year from now, there'll be ample tools and opportunities to work on these things. Yeah, anytime there's a gain of function at potassium channel that potentially causes some kinds of hyperexcitable phenotypes in the nervous system, I can't help but think that it's driving or diminishing excitability of interneurons. I just can't not think that way, but it could be more complex than that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we think's going on with KCNT1. We finally have a model that we think we can use to answer those questions. And but other people think differently. And I think with KCNQ2, 3, Tasso with his model thinks maybe it's something going on in excitatory neurons. I think you saw his talk at AES. So yeah, it'll be really exciting to figure out. Yeah, it'd be great to collaborate in the mouse model with you all.
Good.
I mean, if you just have a look at the data that the Allen Brain Institute provided for single cell transcriptomics, I mean, you can see that the expression, I mean, although there is some expression in the interneurons, it's mostly in the excitatory neurons of the cortex where KCNH1 is really highly expressed. But there are a few interneuron subtypes from their map.
Yeah, I think where I think with, I don't know, I go back to KCNT1 because that's the only one I know, but I think like where in the cell it is can be just as important as obviously how much is expressed. And
yeah, and there can be compensatory changes in the inner neurons because the excitatory neurons aren't behaving as expected. So I think that's where the potassium channel field, there's a lot of dynamic regulation of these channels. So there may be a lot more happening than we know, and it may not all be related exactly to the KCNH1 biophysical change.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, we have been working with single cell transcriptomic data from transgenic mice with different kinds of mutations, and it really can change in every cell type. There can be changes. So I mean, if you at some point plan also to do single cell transcriptomics, then I would also be very happy to be involved, or our lab would be very happy to be involved in that.
So let's see here. I think we just have a few minutes left. I'm just wondering if there's anything on this list that is important to discuss as a group. I think the emerging genetic and molecular therapies is certainly one. I think as Michelle mentioned in her introductory comments, she's worked with IX cells to do at least an initial screen for ASOs, non-specific, non-allele specific ASOs. Those are going to get tested in iPSL neurons in our lab at some point. We got to get the neurons made, but again, I think that the ASO pathway has been made to seem a lot faster and quicker than it is. It has got a lot of bumps in the road, and there was, as probably some on the call know, there was a well-publicized tragic fatal event in an ASO trial at Boston Children's Hospital recently, involving two kids with, or one kid in particular with KCNT1 who died of hydrocephalus, and another kid in the same trial whose hydrocephalus was detected pre-symptomatically, and they corrected it and stopped the ASO. Again, nobody knows why that happened. So there's still a lot of unknowns about these what seem to be magic bullets. But so anyway, just not trying to say not to do it. It's the road is probably a lot longer than we would like to think. What is going on with N-Lorem, by the way, Michelle? Is that an active project with them?
Yes, although there's been no movement for, we're just still waiting on the long read seek results, and they were supposed to be within 90 days. I think it's been like 5 months now, which seems very long to get those results back. So yeah, just waiting on that.
Is that for one particular patient or a bunch?
Yeah, no, just Tristan. They only, as far as I know, at least technically, they only accept the, single cases.
Yeah, their rubric is ultra rare diseases.
Nano rare.
Nano rare, thank you. It's nano rare, which could be, a non-recurrent mutation in a gene that's, for which there's 500 cases.
Yeah.
But that's a unique mutation, so they will take that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's just worth talking about is, and I think it was Wendy Chung's comment in the very beginning that said that it's very important to rally the community and to get them engaged and to, as she put it, not splinter. And I think that was a good way of expressing the phenomenon that I think many of us have seen in rare disease communities where foundations splinter, or there's a separate foundation that gets started. So I don't know where the landscape is right now with KCNH1. I think, again, Michelle, I think you're kind of leading the charge. I don't know how engaged everyone is. Do you have a sense for that? And I certainly was hoping that maybe by doing this webinar today, there would be greater incentive and interest in being engaged community-wide. So what other things could be done to make sure that the community is fully engaged prior to setting up these very important next steps, including a natural history study?
Well, I think this was just a huge step, so I really appreciate you encouraging us to pursue it and make it happen. I appreciate Dr. Michelle's passionate speech. I hope that was effective. So yeah, I think, I think a good, I'll have to look at the registration list, but I think a pretty good percentage of the identified, or that we have access to, contactable patient population turned up today. So I'm hoping this will be a launching point for, increased engagement and involvement going forward, particularly in the natural history study. I know, as Dr. Michelle noted, they can be a pain, so I understand if people get tired of participating, but it's so important.
Yeah.
I do think that whole thing of splintering is so common, and I don't really know how to prevent it. I think it might be just almost inevitable. So what I always tell people is just keep facing forward, keep doing the right thing, keep your arms open, try to meet with everyone, don't shut anyone out. And so hopefully, even if there is a splintering, you'll still be able to work together.
Absolutely.
At Combined Brain, when we let in new disorders, we now have a policy that we let in all the organizations at the same time, and they have to agree on their votes, and they have to agree on their appointments to the committees. So it forces them to work together. So far, we don't have to do that with you all, but we've had to do it with some of the others, and it's our marriage counseling role.
Exactly.
Wonderful.
Exactly. There really isn't another group, right? I mean, there's the Facebook. We heard about the Facebook group, certainly.
Yep. Yeah, the Facebook group has been there and active for years. People are wonderful and supportive on it. But a lot of these families were like the pioneer KCNH1 families that spent the majority of their kids' lives not having a diagnosis. So it's probably a pretty extreme transition to go from never knowing what's going on to like, wow, we could actually do something about this?
Yeah, no, I think it may be that there maybe is, and I've seen this with other organizations. There is a bit of a disease fatigue, I think, that sets in, and
yeah,
some families have just sort of, we have equilibrium, and
yep,
it's not, you don't want to force people to do something they're not interested in doing, but include them.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some families who have kids who are stable and healthy and relatively seizure free and not having terrible sleep problems or agitation or behavior, and they're fine. And so I get that they don't want to take a lot of risks. That's understandable. If you have come to terms with everything and your kid is overall healthy and happy, then why rock the boat?
Yeah.
But that's definitely not everyone.
Yeah. Well, any last comments from anybody? Floor is open.
It just seems to me that you've amassed a really cool team of people here who are all coming at the problem from different directions, and sounds like a whole lot's going to happen in a short period of time in the future, and congrats.
I sure hope so. Thank you. I just appreciate all the people that I mean, with the holidays and everything, those registration invites went out pretty late. And like you, Dr. Weston, I appreciate you jumping on board at the very last minute. So thank you all so much for your time. And I'm really excited about the connections that have been made today and where we're going to take this going forward.
Well, great job, Michelle. You pulled it off. And go have some rest the rest of the day.
Yeah, for sure. And you, like I said, you were very, very central to it happening. So
I just pushed. Listen,
yeah.
Yes, thank you everyone for participating too for this.
Have a great rest of your weekend, everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.